Bonjour à tous, bienvenue.
Welcome everyone. Hello.
Déjà, merci Élise et merci
Thank you to Elise and thank you to
Coty,
Hélène. Thank you
secrétaire
to
général.
Jean-Luc Cortier,
Merci
who's the Secretary
de
General.
Grégoire Moutel qui
Thank you to
ont
Grégoire
travaillé à
Moutel,
ce programme.
who's worked on
Et
this
donc,
symposium.
bienvenue à tous
And
les autres
welcome
et
to
un grand
everyone who is
merci à nos
present today.
intervenants,
And
que vous
thank you
soyez parents,
from
enfants
the bottom of
malades,
my heart
médecins,
to all the
chercheurs
speakers
et
today, whether you're
représentants des labos
parents, researchers,
privés et des
doctors,
institutions publiques.
representatives of private or
Alors,
public laboratories
certains
or
le
public
savent, notre précédent
institutions.
symposium en
So
2021
our
portait sur
symposium in 2021 was
les
about
partenariats
ethics
dans la
in
recherche.
partnerships
Et
in clinical
plus important
research
encore, les retombées pour la
and
communauté des
also the
patients.
impact that it has on
Cette année, nous
patients.
prolongeons
Today, we
cette
are
réflexion en y
continuing
ajoutant un
this
sujet
debate
d'actualité
and we
qui
will be
concerne
talking about a very
l'accès aux innovations
topical
thérapeutiques.
um,
Comme l'an
something very topical,
dernier,
which is
le professeur Grégoire
innovation,
Moutel,
therapeutic
spécialiste du
innovation.
Sénégal
Just like
et
last
du droit
year,
de
President
la
of the
santé au
Caen
CHU de
University
Caen,
Hospital, Grégoire
animera ce
Moutel,
symposium
will
auquel il a
be
tout à
moderating
l'heure
this
largement
symposium.
contribué. Et je le remercie
I've said
vraiment
that
tout
he has
particulièrement.
participated a lot, and I
Deux
do want to
sessions sont
thank
au
him
programme.
again for
La
that.
première
We have
juste
two
après
sessions
l'intervention,
today.
juste après
The
mon intervention,
first one will
sur l'éthique dans
begin
la
right
recherche
after my
clinique,
speech, which it will
aura
be
comme
about
objectif de
ethics.
jeter les bases de l'élaboration d'une charte
And
éthique
so we
et
will
de la
be
constitution d'un comité d'éthique.
discussing how to create a charter
Cette session
when
sera
it comes to
présentée
ethics and
et
an ethics
co-animée par
committee.
Grégoire Moutel et son
Grégoire
collègue
Moutel
Guillaume
and his
Grandazzi,
colleague Guillaume
membre du
Grandazzi will
comité
be
de déontologie et
monitoring this
d'éthique de
session.
l'Université de
Guillaume
Caen.
Grandazzi is a member of the Deontology and
À
Ethics
partir de
Committee at
16
the
heures,
University of Caen.
la deuxième session
At 4 p.m.,
portera
the
sur
second session will
comment
begin,
garantir
and it will be
l'accès aux
about how we can
innovations thérapeutiques
guarantee access to
et plus
innovative gene
particulièrement les thérapies géniques
therapy
pour les patients européens
for
atteints de leucémie.
European
Alors,
leukodystrophy
au travers
patients.
des différentes interventions,
And
on verra que cet
through the
accès est loin
different
d'être garanti
talks, we
et que
will
sans une action forte
be able to see
et
that this is
coordonnée
an
sur
access that's
l'ensemble des
not
parties
always
prenantes,
guaranteed,
la porte pourrait se refermer
and
pour un
that
long moment.
we must
Voilà, je n'en
speak up,
dirai pas plus pour
otherwise the door will
l'instant. Je
be
reprendrai la parole
closed for a
dans la
long
deuxième
period of
session
time.
pour donner quelques
I
informations
will
complémentaires.
now hand over the
En
floor.
attendant, je passe la parole à Grégoire
I
Moutel.
will hand over the floor to Grégoire Moutel.
Grégoire,
Grégoire,
Je mets mon micro.
I am turning on my mic. Thank you very much for
this.
this introduction. Hello to everyone who is present. I will also add something that is very important. As Guy knows, I believe that patients and patient associations have to be able to have knowledge about even the most difficult topics so that they have the knowledge required to discuss with the world of science and also with political leaders and those who make political decisions. I believe that this is part of awareness and part of gaining more knowledge. So our idea for Ella to be able to put in place an ethics committee and have an ethics charter, we needed to mention ethics and a regulatory framework. So this is why I was asked to do this presentation today. It might be very academical, but this was to inform people about ethics, and especially when it comes to rare diseases. I will now be sharing my screen. Hopefully I will be allowed to do that. Can I share my screen? You should be able to. So I will now click on share screen. There's a window that popped up. Maybe I have to authorize something. Not quite sure. So I'm not able to share my screen. Does anyone have access to my PowerPoint? Yes, we will be launching the PowerPoint. You can begin if you want. So is the presentation on the screen? Do I have access to it, or do you have access to it? Okay, let's begin. So I will let you know when to move on to the next slide. So this is the first slide. We can move on to the next one right away. So there are three aspects when it comes to ethics and research that I would like to talk about today. The first one is the protection of persons and respect of the right of patients in research. There has been a lot of progress done. There's very few situations in which patients do not have access to information about research, but there's still room for improvement. And you can also share bad experiences when it comes to this. The second aspect is scientific integrity. We will talk about this today. One of the key aspects of scientific integrity is financial integrity when it comes to conflicts of interest and interest links. Sometimes it's not the patient's interests that are being defended simply because there are other financial aspects at play. And we know that sometimes this is not always in the patient's favor. And the third aspect will be the impact of research and access to the results of research, and how our countries and our institutions can evolve in order for patients to have access to information as quickly as possible. So next slide, the protection of persons in clinical research and medical research is quite an old topic, and I went back all the way to Pasteur, to Louis Pasteur, to remind all of you that to act on a patient's body isn't something that's very well defined, because you have to take into account whether or not there will be progress being made in terms of science. And then when it comes to rare diseases, there's also risky research. And sometimes there's more risk involved than because it can involve reactions in the patient, allergic reactions, inflammatory reactions, all of that. So this is what Pasteur did when he started tasting on his rabies vaccine. He did not know if it would have positive impacts on the tested persons. So next slide. So Pasteur's approach is something that we can still mention today. It's very interesting. Nowadays, we are not questioning research. Back in the day, we used to think that we should not do research on men. However, I believe that if we do not do research on human patients, then we will never evolve, and we will never find more information about pathologies that either people in the room or their children have. And so we have to defend research. And this is what Pasteur did, but he already was starting to define how this research should be regulated. So next slide. We now move on to another part of history, quite a difficult time in history. As some of you know, during the Second World War, there were many abuses, especially in the Nazi concentration camps. Research was being done without respecting the integrity of the human patients and without the consent of these patients. Either they were consenting because they were deprived of their freedom, or either they were never asked for their consent. And so next slide. So this leads us to defining how to go about research. And we could pick and choose some of these aspects for this ethics charter that you are trying to put together. So when research is useful for whether or not research is useful for society, there's a debate there. Because some people say that research is only useful if it has an effect on a majority of the population. And so the question of usefulness is already a big challenge when it comes to rare diseases. I think that we also have to include marginalized population, people in precarity, instead of only focusing on the big fields of research and on the big pathologies, because otherwise we would be excluding many pathologies. Now, I will now go into detail about all of what's on the screen, because that will be left for when we will put together the charter and the committee. But for research to be efficient, some people say that it needs to people living a longer life and in good conditions. But what does that mean, really? So there's a debate there as well, and this is all linked to the cost of research. For example, if research leads to a cancer patient gaining 3 months of life, is it really worth it to invest in order to only give 3 more months of life to a patient? It's a big debate. And then we move on to more traditional aspects, ensure that research and researchers do not put subjects at risk, and that patients can always withdraw from research. And also committees being present who give their go-ahead for research. So now we have the CPP in French, the Committees of Protections of Persons, and it is included in the law, and they give their go-ahead. It's also interesting to talk about patients' associations. I think they should be able to give their green light to certain clinical research. So nowadays, we are asking ourselves if we should not have different committees. And I will give you an example. In the INSERM in France, there's a committee that meets, and then they call upon other participants to assess the research. So next slide. So these are bioethical principles that could be added into the charter. The ones of Tom Beauchamp and James Childress. Indeed, there are key aspects when it comes to ethics. And for those of us, and for those of you who are new to ethics, you will see that this work is incredibly important in order to justify a research project. So next slide. These are the 4 big principles that Childress and Beauchamp mentioned. So there's the right of autonomy, and here you find information consent. It's fundamental that this is respected. And what about what to do with the right of autonomy when it comes to patients who have trouble giving their consent or understanding who has the right to consent for a patient who cannot consent for himself or herself? So this is a big debate. Then there is the principle of beneficence. So research is benevolent. We are not here to do research that isn't for the good of the patients. But we can ask ourselves big questions, especially when it comes to risky research and risky studies. There's also the non-maleficence principle and the principle of justice, and we will come back to that later. Today, people feel like not having access to research is for a type of discrimination at the international level, and there are many patients that are not on an equal footing and who cannot have access to research because of discrimination. But in clinical trials, there are also criteria, scientific criteria, that are necessary for research to be carried out. Certain patients can participate in a study and others cannot. These are the inclusion criteria. And so the patients who cannot take part in the study are always do not always understand. But if there are legitimate arguments, then I believe it's right. However, if there are criteria that discriminate against patients, that this wouldn't be admissible. These principles will be able to guide us. Next slide. So this is the framework of French law. So in France, there is a law that most of you know, because most of you are aware about research, you have already taken part in research. And this law states that no two research projects can be ran at the same time without a control of independent bodies. And it also states that committees to protect persons be created. So why is this law important? Well, this law clearly stipulates that research is legal. So in order to be granted a marketing authorization for a drug, it used to be said that trials had to be done on humans. However, there was also the penal code in France back then that was saying that you could not administer noxious drugs to humans, and so there was a clash. So, excuse me, sorry, I'm hearing somebody talk. Give me 30 seconds. I'm very sorry. I'm working from home today. So yes, so back then in France, you had to be able to be granted a market authorization, and you had to run clinical trials on humans to do so, but you also had the penal code on the other side, which could send you to prison if you administered drugs to patients that were risky. So I'm not here to scare people, but research is risky. There is a risk aspect to it. And in certain cases, it can even lead to the death of the human subject participating. And so this law allowed us to say that, yes, research is necessary, but there will be a framework put in place and a security framework put in place. Next slide. So I will not go into details once again. But so this law mentioned what I said earlier. It stipulates all the big principles, the big international principles and the Nuremberg principles. And what you have to know is that all the conditions have to be met. No condition can miss. So a protocol must have reliable scientific prerequisites. That means studies done on animals. That means in vitro biological research, so that the research project is not too risky for men. There also needs to be an independent committee which assesses the research study. This is all prerequisites, and all these conditions have to be met. They're all essential. I believe that is a key aspect, because it not only reassures the population, the society in general, but it also reassures patients who are taking part in the study. So of course there were big media cases in France and in other countries that have a similar system as France, but research is incredibly safe. And over the past 20 years, there were only 3 to 4 serious accidents in biomedical research in France. It's still too much, of course, but there are so many research studies being carried out, and so in fine, it's a very small number. So next slide. So these committees that I was talking about, the Committee on the Protection of People used to be called the Advisory Committee on the Protection of Persons in Biomedical Research, but this acronym was simplified. It is now CPP in French, and these committees are present in all French regions, and these committees have to be called upon whenever there's a research project, and so this research project have to be presented to the committees before even starting research. So next slide. And we will now move on to very key aspects for you, is that these committees have to include members of civil society, and people from patients' associations can take part in these committees. And it is stated that there has to be people representing patients' associations in these committees. And I believe it is a great aspect because when you have understanding a consent form in a research study depends whether or not you have done studies in medicine. It's a whole different approach depending on what your point of view is. There's also a principle of transparency, and I believe that if there are patients and patients association present, they can challenge the certain aspects of the research and say they disagree with certain aspects, which is progress. Next slide. So we also have to mention independence. You probably understand as well as me that if there's only researchers or people from the industrial sector, people from the medical sector in these committees, I do not want to denigrate them. Without them, progress will not be able to happen. But if they are the only ones in these committees, whether they're driven by a financial aspect or whether they're driven by a medical aspect, then the committees will not be independent. And so people who take part in these committees have to be truly independent. And so this goes back to, once again, patient associations taking part in these committees. So next slide. So these are the roles of the committee. So to talk about the pertinence of the project and also debate the guarantees and the protection for people who are taking part in research. So this can take different forms. It can be, for example, home visits or forms that the patient has to fill out very regularly. These are protection elements that have to be put in place. Plus, you can see that research programs can be very cumbersome for patients, and I would like to thank all patients who are taking part in this research studies. But sometimes it can be very cumbersome when it comes to safety and checks. So taking part in research is not something that is easy. And then a third aspect that they have to debate and take into account is the way people are recruited, whether or not there's discrimination. Is it a random process? Or is it, for example, a researcher who decides to recruit a family that they know well for a research study? This is not necessarily a negative aspect. This is how life works, but you have to be very watchful and careful about respecting equality when it comes to recruitment in research studies. Next slide. So I did want to touch on information. Information is a key topic. You receive new information 12 to 15 times a day about your rights on the internet. Whenever you open up a new internet page, you have to say, I accept. Meaning that sometimes you can be informed without having read anything or signed anything. And when you go to a home appliance store to buy a new refrigerator, you probably sign the contract without even having read it beforehand or having understood it. So when it comes to information, associations have a key role to play. Information has to be accessible and has to be well understood. So the law states that the researcher has to give information orally. This is a very pedagogical approach. But I believe patients' associations can also raise the level of requirements when it comes to information. To have information in videos, for example, to involve psychologists in research. I believe we can always ask for more and improve access to information for patients and people people taking part in research studies. And this will only be able to happen through new procedures. So next aspect. Actually, I will go back to information and talk about continuous information. Often, in the past, we used to say, we'll inform you before the research study and after. Of course, you have to do it. But nowadays, there is a new change. Research studies can take place over 2 to 3 years. It can be cohorts, it can be follow-up studies. You all know this very well. It can be behavioral drug or therapy approaches, and these research can take many years. And so this is why we're emphasizing that patients have to receive continuous information when taking part in a research study, in a research project. And it is not yet part of all research contracts, but if tomorrow you put together a committee, maybe one condition that you can include would be to include qualitative condition when it comes to information, to make sure that patients are informed all the way through the research project. And maybe some people will say that if you share too much, if you give out too much information, then other actors might steal your ideas or try to ask for a patent before you. But I believe we can always find a right solution. So, as I said earlier, that there are fragile people in society, and people who who are not able to understand what is a research project and who are not able to give their consent. And so that's the case for people who are, for example, deprived of freedom or incarcerated. There are people that are incarcerated in mental hospitals as well. And so there is a very specific regulatory framework when it comes to people who are incarcerated taking part in research. There's also big questions about minors. So we usually say that for minors, it's parents that give their consent from a legal point of view, but you all have underage children who want to be informed, whatever their age may be and whatever their disability may be. So it's not because the law states that parents have to give their consent that you should not inform minors. When it comes to pregnant women or women who are breastfeeding, there are risks involved. There are also risks involved for the fetus. So and then the last point on the slide, people who do not have access to universal coverage. So that is to prevent research on migrant populations, for example, to abuse people.
Next slide, please. This is simply by way of information, but I do believe it is important. We'll go quickly. I'd like to remind you that the concept of research isn't just about drugs. It's not just about medications. Of course, you can do research on medications, but you can also research a new surgical techniques. For example, say a surgeon invents a new orthopedic or neurosurgical technique. If that technique has never been validated or approved, you need to do research on it. And also psychological or behavioral studies As I said before, it is important to receive support from psychologists when treating severe or chronic diseases, but in the area of psychology, there are psychobehavioral or therapeutic approaches that have not proved valid. And so sometimes you have psychological support that proves harmful to patients. There are approaches that are very positive, but some types of psychotherapies need to be validated. Now, if we go back to our younger days, we remember that sometimes we're involved in collecting biological sampling campaigns. Your family members have already been asked to take part in genome analysis studies to understand the physiopathology and the evolution of the disease based on genetic markers. Now, there isn't much risk to your health, your physical health, your body. There's no risk of therapeutic accident, no risk of death caused by the clinical trial, but there's something else at stake. Do you have rights over that data? Will you receive the outcome of that analysis? There was a major debate with insurance companies, the risk that genetic data be shared with insurance companies, and as a result, they would be denied coverage. So the idea of individual protection also embraces that aspect of research, collection of biological samples. Next slide, please. A couple of words that I would like to explain so that we can all be on the same page and all talk the same language. Responsibilities in research will differ between the sponsor and the investigator. To keep it short, a sponsor provides material and intellectual resource needed for research to take place. Now, Guy will correct me if I'm wrong, but who can be a sponsor? Well, if you've jointly built the idea behind the research together with scientists and via the donations received by Ella, and these donations are very important for research, then you can fund research. So you are part of that sponsorship effort. So as a sponsor, you have responsibilities, but you can also set terms, and that's very important. Sponsors, particularly financiers, can actually set terms for the research effort. Now, investigators, if we look at our history, they used to be doctors, physicians. So my colleagues, academics, some of you get to work with them in genetic centers or teaching hospitals or reference centers. So these are individuals who are responsible for research, protecting the patient, ensuring their safety, providing them with information. So different levels of responsibility. Next slide, please. Okay, next one. This one isn't fun. Let me say a few words about that. Okay, maybe we should talk about it. It's not too fun, but it's still important. There are risky research efforts ongoing at the moment. What do I mean by risky? Say, as a citizen, you are involved in research. You're doing this for yourself, but you're also doing it for other people. So, say something bad happens during research. Under the law, contingencies, and some contingencies can be severe. Any contingency can give rise to compensation. So, because this doesn't come under the healthcare system, because it's not a disease, you are entitled to insurance. And if a patient is harmed in a major way, they will or their family will receive compensation. So, yes, money can't fix everything. I know it's a poor consolation prize, but I work with courts a lot, investigating medical accidents, and compensation does help the family cope with their difficult situation. It's better that they have the money instead of not having it. So the investigators that I talked about before, I talked about responsibility and liabilities. I'm not going to get back to that, but I would like to emphasize that an investigator, usually a doctor, a physician, a clinician, what is their goal? Well, the care rationale should take precedence over the research rationale. What do I mean by that? I do believe that we need to keep our ear to the ground. Sometimes the whole research rationale comes under so much pressure. If research research could be hurtful to the patient, forget about research. Get back to simple care. That's the key message, but it's a simple message that I want to get across. I believe in research. I think it is essential. I think it's a source of hope for so many patients, but sometimes you need the courage to say, sorry, this research is too harmful, too arduous, too difficult for the patient. Let's go back to simply caring for the patient. Now, in terms of consent, a couple of changes I would like to share with you. I'm not so sure you're as affected as other patients because you're suffering from rare diseases. Now, emergency consent. I have colleagues who work in ER, and when they do research on a myocardial infarction or they use a new therapeutic approach on the streets, even though it's not been validated, because in cardiology you do research in paramedic care as well. So this is an extremely complex situation. So there are specific case scenarios, particularly when consent cannot be provided. So pediatrics. This may concern you, but not necessarily for L-type research, because we're talking about high-level research here, and the risk isn't minimum. But what happens when the parents are separated or disagree on the research? Now, for such research, where there's minimum risk, the consent of one parent is enough. I think it's never a good idea. Why? Because neither the child nor the research should be the subject of parental disagreements. And one last thing, and this could be a painful situation for you if you've lost a loved one. As you know, in genetic research, from time to time, we need to access samples from deceased individuals. For example, sudden death of young adults. There are genetic abnormalities that cause arrhythmia. And so when that happens in France, even if the family is known for carrying the disease, sometimes you need to harvest a sample from the deceased individual. And under the law, because of ethics, you don't need the family's consent to do that because it is so important to the other people in France who suffer from the same disease. It's not about care, it's about research as well. It's an opportunity to inform the children from that same family, the other siblings. Next slide, please. Now, as I said before, continuous information. I'd like to insist on the importance of having quality and continuous information. I talked about that already. Continuous information. I preempted my own slides, apologies. Okay, severe risks. Serious risk. I'm not here to scare you. Number one, they're very rare, these serious risks. And number two, most of the time when they do happen, they're managed properly. But I did want to include this example, which dates back to 2006. It's a case in point. This is a well-designed research effort that went through every single hoop in terms of ethical assessment, clinical approval, etc. And yet there was an incident, something happened. Out of the 8 volunteers, 6 initially presented with severe pain, headache, abdominal pain, etc. So why did this happen? As I said before, by definition, research seeks to validate all of these scientific prerequisites, which may have been established in animal models or in vitro, that is, in the laboratory setting. So when you switch to humans, there are immunological, immunoallergic specificities, which can cause injuries, accidents. So, don't think that this happens regularly. No, these severe events are very rare. But we need to be frank about it. We need to tell you the truth. Okay, so with regard to adverse events and unexpected adverse events, when I talk to people like you, I like to emphasize what follows. When that happens, when there are adverse events, how do you escalate that information? It's not the doctor that does it. The primary source of information is the patient. So it is important to inform the patients who involve themselves in medical research. You are in the driver's seat. You are the primary source of information regarding such adverse events. And it's a pity that some adverse events are not being reported by the patient because they don't dare, they're afraid, they haven't been told how to. So when that event is at first, obviously, when it's severe, usually it goes up the chain, but less significant adverse events don't always make their way up. So, when the product is finally marketed, we can be very clear with people. And we tell them, okay, there's a risk-benefit ratio. These are the benefits, but there are risks involved. And it is thanks to you for talking about your own adverse events that people know about it and that future patients will be told. Next slide, please. Okay, we can skip that one. Nah, it's a little too technical. And this one too. Let's skip it. Next slide, please. Next one, please. Okay. Now, this is the state of the art in terms of French legislation. There haven't been that many changes. I talked about the 1988 legislation called the Urier Act and the role played by the CPP French ethics committees. So that those changes took place over a period of 5 years, in line with EU changes, EU legislative changes. It took 5 years for France to keep up between 2012 and 2017. So the new legislation doesn't change a thing. Next slide, please. However, I do want to show you what the actual changes are. They have to do with the fact that there are different types of research. Earlier, I've been talking about different types of research on medications, on surgery, on very innovative things. You don't always know what the cost-benefit risk or the risk-benefit ratio will be. But when it comes to high-risk interventional research, of course, you need to do everything that I told you. Okay, consent, insurance, ensuring safety and security, all of that is extremely important. And then you have interventional research, objectively interventional research. I'm not sure whether Ella does that kind of thing, but the risks and constraints are minimal. For example, diabetes. When you ask a diabetic to prick the tip of their finger 2 or 3 times a day to check their blood sugar, that's normal. And you tell them, we want to test a new blood sugar device. So instead of pricking your finger 2 or 3 times, you need to do it 4 or 6 times because we need to check which device works best. So yes, this is interventional research. It does have an impact on the person's life, but from an objective point of view, it is risk-free. Yes, it's no fun, but it is risk-free. And this causes minimal constraints. And then there's a third type of research, observational or non-interventional research. The patient is simply asked to provide its own health data so that we can monitor changes in the disease, so we can understand the natural course of the disease. So usually this is retrospective information on your medical file, or you can be asked to answer questionnaires. What's your experience of the disease? What's your school life like? How are you doing at school? If the patient is a child, what's the impact of that particular therapy on the life of the family, etc. So as you can see, this is not interventional. You're not having an impact on the person's body. Next slide, please. So this is why the law has changed. The goal was to provide different frameworks and different constraints depending on the type of research. First of all, to be pragmatic, and also to lighten the load of those CPP ethics committees, because those ethics committees spend a lot of time on the first category, interventional research. So, as you can see, everything that I just said comes into alignment. You need assurance, insurance, free and informed consent, etc., etc. So these are the maximum requirements for this type of research, interventional research. Second type, and this makes sense. The procedures are more lightweight because this is part and parcel of routine care for the patient. Yes, those are interventional types of research with minimal risks and constraints. It has nothing to do with medication. What's important is providing information to the patient and getting their consent. And here again, You don't need insurance. And this means the research approach is lighter. And third category, non-interventional research. You're not having an impact on the person's body. And here, what's important is rights, access to your data. You know the CNIL, the French Data Protection Watchdog, and also GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation at the EU level. That's also important. It is important for patients to be informed. It is important for patients to be able to object or oppose that type of research. So again, this is a third category that is different than the first two. Next slide, please. We talked about that. Okay. I want to discuss the other two aspects. How am I doing for time? Good. Okay, the other two aspects of research ethics. Let's first talk about scientific integrity. Scientific integrity. When you go home tonight, well, you're probably already home, but when you have dinner tonight, don't go around telling people that Professor Moutel told us the world is an awful place, there's conflicts of interest everywhere. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that industry is all about the money, etc. No, of course, there's more to it than that. However, in terms of scientific integrity, and I think we'll get back to that, we'll discuss it during the next roundtable, there's a lot about public-private partnerships, which are a very good thing. But we can well imagine that a scientist, assuming they're a doctor, assuming they're honest, but just because they filed a patent or they want to make money or they have a partnership with an industry player or maybe academic institutions such as the INSERP Institute or the CNRS Research Institute, etc., there's a drive for, it's a case of public should perish. And if you are under pressure to perform and publish and provide results, etc., well, it is possible that your integrity will lapse. So it is important to take that into account. Yes, I promise, Guy. Give me a minute. I think we're good, Grégoire. Go ahead. Okay, I just need 5 or 10 more minutes. Promises, promises. So sometimes experts are complicit with the industry player. You've all heard about the Mediator scandal. It's a public health scandal which has raised the question of integrity, the integrity of medical experts. Yes, that's the exception that confirms the rule. Yes, it doesn't happen all the time, but we need to be extremely vigilant, particularly patient groups such as Ella. Next slide, please. We need to take a look at something that I care very much about. Just because there have been abuses before doesn't mean we should forbid everything. We keep hearing politicians that there should no longer be public or private partnerships because by definition private sector is the devil. All they want is to make money, etc., etc. I'd like to remind you that there are scandals that have emerged in the public sector. The contaminated blood scandal, that has nothing to do with the private sector. The asbestos scandal as well, that was a public sector scandal. So we need to regulate, yes, but we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There are excellent public-private partnerships out there. And sometimes you have a combination of activities, in other words, a collaboration between a researcher and a company because they need to devise a new drug. But there are very strict rules for that kind of work so that integrity will be maintained, so that basically they won't tip over into the dark side. So, regulation is key. I said that. Next slide, please. I promise I'm not going to review this entire slide. There is a legislative framework. The Bertrand Act provides rules for transparency, and under those rules, any partnership can be checked, has to be transparent, all the information has to be disclosed, and can be criticized in the court of public opinion. to make sure that interests don't turn into conflicts of interests. Next slide, please. This is an important aspect that I want to talk about because in the media, people confuse interest with conflicts of interest. We all have interest. Intellectual interest, for example. Say a researcher collaborates with the drug industry. They have an interest, an scientific, an intellectual interest, sometimes even a financial interest, which is necessary because you spend time developing that research. So it is in your interest that it succeed, right? There's nothing wrong with an interest, quote unquote, per se. Okay? There's a problem when that interest turns into a conflict of interest. The interest, there's nothing wrong with an interest as long as you're aiming for something positive, for example, the interest of the patient, the interest of research. But when that is misused, and the interest turns into a conflict of interest, then you're in trouble. So, and I believe that patient groups and ethics committees do have and should have a say. When partnerships are put together, they need to be vigilant. When it comes to interest, you need to know exactly who your partner is. I don't have any example to share with you, but there are projects out there who are proposed, and from the get-go, you're wondering, whose interest is this project serving? And it's up to you to decide, yes, I'm okay with that project, or no, I'm not okay with that project, because there are potential conflicts of interest. Next slide. I suggest you read this at your leisure. These are the different types of interests. Like I said, there are other interests besides financial interest. In a society, there are ideological, political, familial interests as well. I suggest you check out this website, transparency-france.org, or just check out the Global Transparency International website. There's great stuff on conflicts of interest. Next slide, please. Now, we said that before, so we can skip it. Okay. Behind scientific integrity and conflicts of interest, actually behind conflicts of interest is the idea of integrity. Here again, I don't want to scare you into thinking that this is a big bad world. Far from it. But there are breaches of scientific integrity at times. And here again, patient groups need to be vigilant. You know, it's like any profession. You got good bakers and bad bakers, good butchers and bad bakers. There's always going to be a bad apple on the cart. So there's one thing that you need to pay close attention to. It's not fraud exactly. It's fake science. When people don't really have sufficient evidence, but they publish a paper when they don't have enough hindsight and they don't have enough data. And I think this is tragic because people are misled into believing that the research outcome is positive, but maybe it just means that the research wasn't properly conducted. So if we push the research further and waited 6 more months or 1 more year, the result might be different. So it is important to validate research and evidence. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm sure you understand that. There can be severe breaches of trust, and this has an impact on everybody, but obviously it is the patients, first and foremost, who are impacted, because if there's bias in a clinical trial, this means that a treatment is marketed, and that treatment does not meet the requirements of science, and that's bad. That's severe. To give you an idea, around the world there are fewer than 5 or 10 such situations over the past 10 years. So that kind of thing happens very, very rarely. Next slide. Okay, this is one example. It happened in Japan. The STAP cells, this was a major breach of scientific integrity, and the director who supervised the dissertation of that young student felt responsible for that breach and killed himself. Obviously, if this happens, if there's a breach of scientific integrity, I'm not asking every person responsible to please kill themselves. Obviously not. But in some cultures, losing face is cause for suicide. Okay, I promise 5 more minutes, Guy. I know I said that 3 times. This is a perfect segue into part 2 of our talk. We'll have players representing industry and institutions. The issue of access to the outcome of research, that's important. Next slide. We all need research. We all agree that research is good. But there's another question we need to ask. What's the point of research? If you do research and you stay in your lab, what happens once the research is over? The outcome of that research isn't made available to society at large and doesn't benefit patients. What's the point of research if the outcome is not made available to society at large? So we need to anticipate. When you develop research efforts, will that be incorporated into public health policies? That's a real challenge. And this ties in with the whole debate on patents and commercialization of patents. Today, it is well possible to develop research in France. I think this is something that ELA cares very much about, and other nonprofits as well in many other European countries. You may have research developed in one country using that country's resources, that country's hospitals, their patients, their research institutions, and then the research is patented, but that patent will be used, commercialized in a different country. And as a result, this raises a fundamental ethical issue because the patients were told, hey, you participate in the research, and yet they don't get to see the color, the benefit of their work. Someone else gets to benefit, so there are political choices that are being made. So I believe that in today's political world, the rationale isn't long-term enough. Research rationales aren't long-term enough. Meanwhile, I'm saying it is the result of a political decision, but this was the subject of a discussion as part of the most recent presidential elections, how to relocate, bring back to France medical efforts or research efforts. Do we have the resources we need in order to produce medications and treatments right here in France? And we can expand that question to the rest of the EU. Next slide, please. At the moment, we could say that politicians aren't thinking about this enough. Resolution of such conflicts mostly comes from the free market economy and the conjunction between supply and demand. So it's a capitalist kind of regulation. So if we want to ensure access to innovation, you need political management. You can't just trust the market. Next slide, please. And this is the second to last slide. From the point of view of research, a lot of questions arise. Now, I know that Ella works with researchers and scientists and doctors a lot. We're not comfortable when it comes to patients. If we tell them, please participate in the research because this will help other patients in the future, if we promise them that, and at the end of the day, nobody gets to benefit, we've lied, basically, and it's a problem. And what about unfairness at the international level? It's part of the debate as well. There are countries where the outcome of research is accessible, other countries where it's not accessible. And you will know, and I know how much suffering some of your families have incurred. For patients, it is tempting to go get care elsewhere, to travel to a different country where treatments are accessible. So we need to bear that in mind. There's a political aspect, but also let's not forget the human factor. Let's not forget the distress and the suffering when you know you're entitled to a treatment and yet you don't have access to it. It is my last slide, I promise. As I said before, I believe that as part of today's discussion, and I'm not just pontificating, I believe that these questions are important. We need to discuss them, but for that we need to hear the patient's voice. We need to hear the voice of users. And many thanks to you all. That'll be my last slide. And if you have any questions, I am on hand. Thank you very much.
Merci Grégoire.
Thank you, Grégoire.
En fait, je deviens très rapidement et très
So I will very briefly be moderator so that you can take a breath. It was a very rich presentation. It contained a lot of information, and I believe it was key for the people present today, and even for myself, to talk about these issues. I will now be giving the floor to Guillaume Grandazy, and Grégoire, you will then also be able to take the floor. Guillaume Grandazy will talk about scientific questions and questions of ethics and deontology, and I believe it's key that Guillaume talks about this. For some it will be a reminder, for others new information. Thank you very much, says Guillaume. Yes. Grégoire did mention the key aspects of research, the key challenges. There are some that are already properly regulated, anything that has to do with the protection of persons, the committees that are already in place. Many things exist. And when it comes to integrity, we still have challenges to face and to solve, but progress has been made. When it comes to regulation of conflicts of interests and interests. And as he said, one of the key ethics aspects today and one of the key challenge that we are collectively facing as a society, but mainly for patients, is access to the results of research, access to innovation. And there was a paper that was published by the National Committee of French Ethics about access to therapeutical innovations. And they put a big emphasis on the price of drugs, the negotiations on the prices of drugs, which obviously we will mention in the second part of this session in the afternoon, but it is also part of what Grégoire mentioned earlier. So the challenges for an ethics committee and the challenges when it comes to redacting a charter, what are these challenges? Well, beyond just the theoretical questions and the practical questions, ethics challenges when it comes to ethics involve all of us. It involves society, researchers, actors in the industry sector, patients, etc. And so we have to share our ideas. We have to debate and collectively discuss ethics in a pluridisciplinary context. And beyond just this aspect of pluridisciplinarity and pluriprofessionality, we also have to involve patients and patient groups. They are not always considered as needing to take part in these discussions, about law, about medicine, in committees. But far too often we only leave very little room for them, for patient groups, and we need to strengthen the role of civil society in these committees. So that's one aspect, because these ethical debates grow and evolve from the diverse participants that take part, because they all have different points of view, different origins, different ideas. And I am a sociologist, and we see that the point of view of patients is key. It has to be taken into account, especially when it comes to certain diseases. So to regulate research, whether it be integrity, protection of people, and access to the results of research, or even access to innovation, it is all key to regulate. So there's the aspect of clinical trials, and there's also the aspect of access to treatment. But we have to distinguish them. They're different, but they are both key. And today there is one challenge, a challenge of regulation, and also the challenge of strengthening the role of civil society. And these committees enable us to share values and to discuss. I know that Ella International has certain values. These values are published on its website. And it's very important to remind everyone of these values and to voice them, to defend these values in a more institutional framework, such as in ethics and deontology committee, for example. Ethics is being talked about a lot more. It is a fashionable topic. But not all actors share the same values and only use ethics as a smokescreen. So it is important to that there be discussions about ethics and that all actors have to be involved in a binding way, whether it be. And it's important that that industry, that researchers also have to respect and defend these values. So why put together an ethics committee? Well, the first mission of such a committee would be to write a charter that can be shared and co-redacted by all the different partners, by all the different stakeholders of research, so that this charter can turn into a framework within which all actors agree to respect certain values and defend these values. Values that will be defended and voiced by all the stakeholders. As Grégoire said earlier, and as it was mentioned as well, there are financial interests at play. That's logical. Of course, we live in a capitalist industrial society. But these financial interests often do not put the patients, because of this financial interest, patients are not always put first. And we push morals to the side, but there is a big ethical challenge today. And we have to really understand research and understand what the social responsibility of researchers is, what is the added bonus of research for society. And maybe we can debate about this during the debate period of this session. So maybe let's take an example of a researcher who's focusing on rare diseases, for example. It needs maybe the biggest gift for a researcher working on such topics is for his or her research to be made available to everyone, to have their research accessible. And we can all contribute to that. And this also ties in with the principle of justice and of usefulness of research for society. So maybe we can now open up the debate to the different participants so they can share their opinion. Yes, Guillaume, we haven't discussed how we will be doing this, but I think we should hand over the floor to the participants. Yes, indeed. So this is how we told you earlier how you can raise your hand so you can share your opinion. Do not hesitate to raise your virtual hand to ask a question and you will be handed the floor. We cannot see the participants, that's right. So Emmanuel, you can turn on your mic. Yes. Good. Hello, everyone. I'm the mother of Vianney. Vianney passed away from leukodystrophy. Can you hear me okay? So he passed away from leukodystrophy 8 years ago, and I wanted to share something. I believe that the debates about ethics are very positive. Indeed, 10 years ago, we did not talk about ethics. When you were a parent, you would learn that your child was sick, and then researchers would ask us to take part in trials and almost secret trials. We would be asked to try new drugs, but it was outside of an ethical charter, outside of a regulatory framework. But as parents, we had only one choice, was to say yes and try out these things, because we knew that our children otherwise were going to pass away. And so I believe that these debates and these questions that are being raised about ethics are very positive and important, because, of course, it's all questions that involve our children that are suffering from these diseases. And it involves medical association, patient groups, and I just wanted to say that the presentation that we just heard in the previous presentation are very positive. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you for sharing. I know it's always difficult for parents. Parents have gone through lots of suffering and who have lost a child. I believe that you are completely right. When it comes to medical research, there needs to be transparency. That's the main aspect. And when there's transparency, the results are even better. All the amateur research that was done in the past, of course, I'm not denigrating what has been done in the past by colleagues who are just trying their best, but anything that is outside of a well-organized and well-structured research does not have as much of a positive impact. So research has to abide by certain regulations, whether it be at the international, national level. It's a question of ethics as well. We can no longer, as was done in the past, to try out try methods on the site. So I, of course, did not want to criticize what has done in the past. Indeed, as parents, when we learned about the diagnostic, we tried out things. I'm sorry, I'm not using the right words here, but our children were enabling research to evolve, but it was all research that was done outside of a framework. So I did want to say once again, it's very positive. Thank you very much. And I was very clumsy. I'm very sorry. Not at all. Do not apologize, says Grégoire. Jean-Luc wanted the floor. Yes, good. Hello, Grégoire. You mentioned earlier a very complex topic of interest and conflicts of interests. So when it comes to interests and conflicts of interest, is an employee of a pharmaceutical industry, can an employee of a pharmaceutical industry take part in a scientific committee, one such as the Scientific Committee of Ella? I believe that yes, because when it comes to ethics, we should hear the voice of everyone and the opinion of everyone. However, you do have to have the right approach. And so this voice would be a minority voice. But of course, we see that we are talking about certain topics, and of course we need to hear the voice of everyone, and even industry, because maybe an actor from the industry can then also relay information and share information with his or her partner. So my response would be yes. But I do have to say one thing. If one day there is an opinion that has to be given, or a decision that has to be taken that involves the employee's company, then in this case, this person would have to leave the committee because it involves their company directly. I don't know if I responded to your question. Yes, thank you very much. Jean-Hugues wanted the floor. Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. I have to agree with Grégoire. I believe that the industry should be present in these committees because we have to strike the right balance. And when it comes to the topic of rare diseases, we have to move together. It's very long research that is costly, and research that comes from universities at first. It all started with universities, so outside of the industry world, and then the industry arrived and brought a certain know-how, and sometimes even brought money, not always, but money that allowed researchers to develop a product. So we cannot pretend to be perfect and say that the industry has nothing to do here. No, we have to move together, but there has to be a proper structure that defines the role of each participant, and it has to all be a very transparent process. We have to know who is who around the table. We have to know the interests of each of everyone, who is defending the interests of patients, who is defending the private interest, who is defending financial interests, etc. And we mustn't oppose people. Of course, the patient's interests has to be put first. We have to protect patients, but we mustn't make a caricature of this debate and say that there's the good ones on one side and the bad ones on the other. Because if we simplify the debate in this way, then this debate will no longer grow. I completely agree, Jean-Hugues. It is definitely key. And I did say it in my presentation. I feel like society ostracizes different groups. We put the good people on one side and bad people on the other. But this is not the way forward. There is a question from Amadeo. You can take the floor. Amadeo Corre, you can take the floor.
Hello, good afternoon. I wanted to share my experience. I have minoritarian disease. I've been present in different clinical essays, and the only thing I wanted to say is that I've been very well treated.
I just wanted to share my experience. I had a very good experience in clinical trials.
Minoritarian.
There were very good clinical trials.
Tell people that they shouldn't think that clinical trials is some sort of a taboo. There are many people and many professional people, and I just wanted to share this.
Juste, je ne sais pas est-ce qui veut réagir. Moi, juste pour être très honnête, j'ai eu un tout petit problème. Je n'avais pas activé la traduction au tout début, donc j'ai eu que la fin.
I hadn't put.
Est-ce que peut-être on peut répéter la question en français?
Maybe we can repeat the question in French.
Sí, no. Yo lo que quería era compartir mi experiencia. What I wanted to do was to share my experience because I suffer a rare disease. I've participated in several clinical trials and I've been very well treated, both from the point of view of information and from the point of view of treatment during the trial. So I'd like to encourage people to participate in such trials, and they shouldn't see them as something strange. They are some very professional people. I've been treated by. So I just wanted to share my experience.
No sé si se oye.
I don't know if you could hear me. I'd like to encourage everybody to participate.
Do you want to say something? I would like to thank Amadeo. So when you give a presentation about ethics, we often talk about everything that goes wrong, all the serious issues, but as I've said during my presentation, in the majority of situations, clinical trials are organized in a very professional way. And this is why I talked about the different frameworks and regulation frameworks that I talked about, because this is what allowed professionality. And there are a lot of actors in science today that respect the right rule. So thank you, Amadeo. Thank you for pointing this out. Research is often a good experience for patients. So thank you for emphasizing this. I don't know if Guillaume wants to say something. Indeed, but when it comes to ethics, I believe that we usually mention what's not working right so that we can improve and render better the ethical framework. But so we often just mention what goes wrong, or comments by patients that say, "Oh, this is something completely wrong happened to me." And this is what we often mention. We also often talk about bad working conditions for researchers. So, of course, we focus on the situations that aren't right. And this is exactly the same with the industry. There are actors from the industry that work with the best interests of in the best interest of patients. But there is research that is financed by non-profits, and then the price of the outcomes of research is sometimes too high, and there are questions and debates about the criteria that we should set to select all the different patients that are eligible for research and that are eligible for treatment. I know that sometimes companies use, or the industry uses, a random system to select patients, or sometimes hospitals that choose, and it's not available to everyone. But this all happens in a framework that is not very transparent. And it's very upsetting that patient groups not be informed and not be involved in these choices, which are ethical choices, and that involve everyone, the whole of society. Thank you. So this will now be time for the break. There were other hands that were raised, so maybe we will be able to take these questions at the end of the second part. We will now take a very short break of less than 10 minutes, and we will start again at 4 p.m. Thank you very much. See you at 4.
Bien, on va reprendre, Grégoire.
Let's get back to work.
Je suis là.
Are you ready, Grégoire? Yes, I am.
Je pense qu'on peut reprendre.
Okay.
Je vais juste
Let's
faire
resume our
une
conversation.
introduction, si tu veux bien.
A quick introduction, if I may. A little bit of information regarding the second topic of the day. I'll be quick. But I still think it's important that I do it. As you well know, at the moment there are two gene therapies against leukodystrophy, LIBMALDI for metachromatic leukodystrophy and Skysona. And they have proved their interest therapeutically because they have obtained the market authorization earlier. This was a subject of a question from one of the participants. So the marketing authorization was obtained in 2020 and 2021, respectively. And as you know, these treatments can save lives. Since its inception in 1992, the ELA Association has made significant contributions to the discovery of such treatments. Over 12 million euros have been invested into research on both leukodystrophies. So ELA families have waited for this first success for 30 years, and it looks like we're going to have to wait a little longer because those treatments aren't yet available or are already not available in Europe. We'll try to understand why, because it is important. And also we'll look at potential solutions for making those treatments accessible as quickly as possible. So when it comes to LIBMALDI, I'm going to let Dr. Pascal Vincendo, who's medical director at Orchard Therapeutics, to please tell us more. And with regard to Skysona, unfortunately, because Bluebird Bio couldn't make it today, we did invite them, but they're not here. I'm going to give you information in a way that is as objective as possible. Skysona received a marketing authorization from the EMA in July 2021, and Bluebird Bio, the laboratory, decided to leave Europe. A month later, we wonder why. The families are wondering why. So what are the official reasons the laboratory touted? They say they are in a difficult financial spot. They say that the reimbursement process is long, probably too long, and also that the value of the therapy for patients and for society is not sufficiently taken into account, not sufficiently recognized. So since withdrawing from Europe, Bluebird Bio has refocused its activity in the US, where it's getting very positive signals. On September 19th, so just last week, Skysona received a fast-tracked marketing authorization for the U.S. market from the American equivalent of the EMA, which is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So that is the current status of both gene therapies. I'd like to remind you that this is the first treatment against leukodystrophy. We've been waiting for this for 30 years. We've been supporting this effort for 30 years. And we're here to discuss this. Why is it taking so long? And how much longer do we need to wait before those treatments become available to French families and families from other countries as well? And we are very fortunate to have every stakeholder sitting around the table, and they're here to provide you with explanations. So let's all put our heads together and see how we can fast-track this process so the treatments can become available to patients. And I am done with this quick introduction. Let's now hear from Ms. Grégoire. We're also looking forward to hearing from Matteo's parents and also Colin and Alice's mom. We're looking forward to hearing from families who've been through that process, who were almost been through that process. It is important to hear from the families as well. This is part and parcel of the spirit of today's seminar. Now, tying in with the first roundtable, when we talked about ELA's potential charter, I'm not saying that ELA's charter is going to change the world overnight, but it does seek to set out a number of milestones and also take a public stance on those issues. And obviously, when you take a public stance, you need to base yourself on patients' experience and what patients want. And obviously, industry may have other constraints and other realities, but I think it really is important to voice, to voice what families have to say. So we're looking forward to the hearing from the families of Colin and Alice and Matteo.
Elodie,
Over to you.
c'est à toi.
Elodie, you're on.
Oui, bonjour, vous m'entendez?
Hello, can you hear me?
Oui, très bien.
Yes, we can. We hear you
Bonjour.
loud and clear. Hello, Elodie. Hi.
Donc, je suis ici, voilà, pour témoigner un peu de
Well,
notre
I
expérience.
want to share with you our story.
Donc, nous n'avons pas pu avoir la chance de bénéficier de
We
cette
did not have
épidémie,
the good fortune
alors
of having
qu'on avait
access to that
longuement
gene
discuté,
therapy,
on
even
était
though
partis
we
pour.
had long talks about it. We were
Matteo
all for it.
est un petit garçon
Matteo is a little boy.
plein d'énergie. Et qui allait
He has
très
a
bien
lot of
lorsqu'on avait
energy and he
découvert
was
sa
doing
maladie.
fine when we
Lorsqu'elle
discovered
a
that he had the
commencé à
disease.
se développer, après
And he started to grow.
ces cliniques qui n'ont pas fonctionné, nous avons
Unfortunately,
décidé
the clinical trials did not work, and so
de partir
we put our heads
sur
together and
ce
we
choix de
decided
la
to
thérapie génique.
go for gene therapy.
Donc on avait avancé
So
et
we moved forward,
d'un rendez-vous, voilà,
and
pour parler de cette date,
we had an
cette
appointment
greffe
during
qui
which we were
allait
supposed to
pouvoir se
talk
faire.
about
Donc
the
on
potential
nous a
start of that
annoncé
gene
que ce
therapy.
n'était plus
And
possible,
during that appointment, we were told that it wouldn't happen.
que le traitement n'était
We
plus
were told
disponible.
that the treatment
Voilà,
was no
donc
longer available.
Matteo a eu une allogreffe
Matteo received
qui,
an
la
allo
première
transplant.
greffe qui s'est au
The
départ bien
first
passée.
transplant
Et
went well,
après un
at
mois
least
et
at
demi,
first, and after a month
Matteo
and a
a
half, my
fait
son
un rejet de cette greffe.
rejected the transplant.
Voilà, donc il a été à nouveau
So, graft
hospitalisé.
versus
Et
host
avant
disease.
sa
And as a
seconde
result,
greffe,
he was hospitalized,
beaucoup de temps, donc il y a eu
and it took a long time.
beaucoup de complications.
There were lots of
Et,
complications.
ça a été très compliqué pour lui.
Things were very difficult for
Excusez-moi.
Matteo. I'm sorry.
Donc nous sommes toujours dans le parcours, donc il a eu sa greffe.
So,
En
he received
elle-même,
the
pour
transplant.
l'instant,
We haven't given up.
ça va.
So far,
Mais,
so
on
good,
est
fingers
toujours dans
crossed.
les complications
But
et,
there are still
et
complications.
voilà, ce n'est toujours pas fini. Bon, est-ce que ça aurait
It's
changé
not the
quelque
end of the
chose ou
road
pas?
yet.
Peut-être.
So,
En tout cas, ce rejet de
would
la
the gene
première
therapy
greffe,
have made a
peut-être qu'on aurait
difference?
pu l'éviter.
Maybe we could have avoided
Voilà, pour l'instant,
the
il
graft
va
versus
quand
host
même bien,
disease.
il a toujours
Maybe he would
beaucoup
not have
d'énergie.
rejected the
Mais,
transplant. So
mais
Matteo
on
still
avance
has a lot of energy, but
doucement, mais
and we're still moving
et
forward
puis, voilà,
step by
chaque
step.
jour est un peu compliqué.
Things are difficult every day.
Voilà, je suis désolée, j'ai encore beaucoup d'émotions.
I'm sorry, I'm emotional.
C'est encore difficile pour moi d'en parler.
It's still
Mais
not an
voici,
easy topic for
voilà
me
mon
to
témoignage.
address.
Après, je peux répondre éventuellement
But that's what I can
à des
tell you
questions
about
s'il y
our
a des
experience,
questions.
and if there are any questions, I'm here.
L'émotion d'abord, elle est normale.
Oh, Elodie.
D'être fois devant un peu dans ma consultation, donc c'est gênant parce qu'il y a plein d'autres gens autour.
Elodie,
L'émotion, vous inquiétez pas, on la
don't worry
comprend
about
tous.
emotional.
Non, juste si on va
I
un peu
get it,
dans
we
le
all
débat
get it.
d'aujourd'hui, vous
It's a
diriez
bit different
que
for you because
vous avez
usually
été
when we talk,
suffisamment
we
informé,
have
vous
the
avez
intimacy of my
compris les
practice, and
enjeux,
here we have
hein,
lots of
alors,
people
ce qui veut dire de comprendre,
listening
c'est
in,
toujours un
but
sentiment
it's
d'incompréhension,
perfectly
mais
all right.
est-ce qu'au fond, vous
So,
comprenez la logique qui a amené ça,
obviously, there are
ou
things
est-ce
that
que
are
vous auriez
difficult to
des idées
understand,
pour vous dire que ça pourrait
but
être différent?
do you understand the
La
rationale
logique
behind
qui,
that
c'est-à-dire
no, behind the
pour ne plus avoir
refusal?
accès à la thérapie
Are you
génique
saying, do I
Est-ce que
understand
vous
the
est-ce que
reasons
vous
why
avez
you
compris
no
les
longer have
contraintes ou les
access to the gene
absurdités du
therapy?
système
Do you
qui font
understand
que
how
vous
absurd
avez
the
bien
system is?
identifié les
The
blocages? Est-ce que vous
constraints
voyez là, ces
involved?
blocages,
Have you
finalement, comment est-ce que vous pourriez les
identified
débloquer?
the blockages, and do you have any
Alors,
ideas in terms of how to overcome those obstacles?
les lever, honnêtement, je sais pas.
Honestly, I
À part,
don't know. How
voilà,
can
le
we
fait
overcome
de
those
faire des
obstacles?
interventions peut-être comme celle-ci pour
A
montrer
seminar such as
que nous sommes
today's is
nombreux à pas
useful.
comprendre ce
We
choix
get to show that there
et
are many of us who do not
essayer
understand that
d'avancer.
decision, and we try to
Après,
move
non,
forward
honnêtement,
no matter what.
je sais pas
But
comment.
honestly,
Mais par contre,
I don't know how
j'ai
we can
compris
overcome those
pourquoi Matteo
obstacles,
n'avait pas
but
pu
I
avoir
do
accès
understand now
à la
why
thérapie génique.
Matteo was
Vous pouvez nous dire si
deprived
vous en
of
avez compris,
access
justement, pourquoi?
to gene therapy. Can you tell us more about your understanding. What is it that you understood exactly? Well, I understand that the laboratory left the country and that the treatment would not be available in France. I understand that the people in charge had blocked the process for authorizing the drug or the treatment in France, that they needed to think a little longer before approving access to the treatment. But we may not have that kind of time. The time frame for administration, the time frame for medical research is a different time frame than for families and patients. Thank you so much for your story. Can you hear me? Yes, we can.
Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Donc, j'interviens aujourd'hui en tant que maman de Alice et Colline, donc
I'm a mother.
qui sont porteuses de leukodystrophie.
Both my daughters, Colin and Alice, have metachromatic leukodystrophy, MLD. So let me share with you my story. I took down a couple of notes because, and I'm going to read my speech if that's okay, because when you're the mother of a special needs child, an extraordinary child with special needs, but extraordinary nonetheless, it's an interesting journey. So our older daughter, Alice, developed normally until age 2, and then she developed symptoms of the disease, including spasticity, sleep disorders, etc. In early 2020, or specifically in February, she spiked to fever, and she lost all motor functions within 4 weeks. She couldn't walk anymore, she couldn't sit, she couldn't talk by herself. So we received the diagnosis on April 1st, 2020, and 3 weeks later, after a genetic analysis, so we got the confirmation that this was a case of MLD, metachromatic leukodystrophy. Now, for Alice, there was a proposition, a therapeutic trial, an intrathecal enzyme injection regimen, so in Paris, once a week, over an indefinite period of time, and we were told that the treatment could at best stop progression of the disease, or at the very least to slow it down. So we asked ourselves a lot of questions. Should we be part of that protocol? And at the time, Alice clearly didn't sleep throughout the night because of the extreme pain. She couldn't stand being in the car too long, and day after day she would lose even more her ability. So going back and forth with Paris, with all of those unknown factors in the equation, simply made it impossible. So obviously, as parents, we always have a choice. I'd like to emphasize that it was suggested that we join that therapeutic trial. It was our choice. So what is it that helped us make that decision? We had the healthcare protocols and also discussions with specialists in Paris who told us exactly what would happen, and also the initial results from the other patients. So we had a lot of oral discussions. We didn't hear much that was convincing. And also, considering the rate of progression of disease, Alice soon no longer qualified for the protocol. She no longer met the requirements. So the decision was made for us. Decision was made for us. So there's a question that I try not to ask myself too much, but it does tie in with what we're discussing today. Could we have made a decision more easily or more quickly if the therapy had been accessible and a little closer to home? For example, when you are further away from a research center, does that mean your access to a particular protocol is hampered? So much for Alice, but the adventure continues we have another daughter. So the diagnosis for Alice came at the end of April 2020, and so we analyzed her little sister's genome, who was 11 months old at the time. She was fine, 0 symptoms, and 3 weeks later we got the result, and we were told that Colin also carried the gene for MLD. So right away, we were told that Colin carried the gene for MLD, but that there was hope because there was a gene therapy trial going on in a hospital in Milan, Italy. And so we had a meeting with the French doctors and the entire team in Milan, and 2 weeks later, we packed a car and we drove to Milan for a 4-month therapy. So between the first time I heard the word leukodystrophy, which wasn't part of my vocabulary, so April 1st, 2020, it took 2 months until we left for Milan. And during that time, Alice's condition deteriorated. We thought a lot about her own therapy. We heard the diagnosis about Colin. We had to manage her pain. We'd never been to a hospital before that. And all the constraints due to the lockdowns, because we were in the middle of COVID, spring 2021. So when we got to Milan, in addition to the fact that Milan is far away from France, a protocol was suggested to us. So clearly, we didn't have the brain space to know what to do. All of the consent forms and the whole consent process, that felt so removed from us. All we wanted to know is that that Colin had a chance. So sign here at the bottom of the page, and that's what I did, without necessarily understanding what I was signing up for. So in terms of the things that I found helpful throughout that period, maybe this will be useful to other families. We've been talking about that since the beginning. Access to information is key. Information on the disease, obviously, you need to know what's going on, what's happening to our daughter, what's going to happen to us as a family in the near future, but also over the long term. It's great. There are non-profits, there are websites such as Ella's, providing a lot of information, and I think it's great. It's sufficient information, it's accessible. And then information on available treatments. That's a little more complex because there are a lot of protocols. We were told about a lot of protocol, and this is not the kind of language we're used to as parents. We're not doctors. We don't work in the medical field, and so it's important for specialists to dumb it down when they talk to families. And also, we wish we had had more information in written form. So we received a lot of information orally in terms of what happens to the other patients, what happens in terms of the children progressing, and also the intermediate results, but nothing is consolidated. So people tell us, don't raise your hopes up, or do hope there is a chance, but for that we need written information, or at the very least, it would have been useful to me. Also, information regarding the different steps in the therapeutic process, because you move into a process, you need to know what to expect. First, the enrollment tests, and then specific manipulations, little things that need to be done. So the timeline is important. And also, what happens during therapy and after therapy, what this means in terms of following up or monitoring the child, and what happens to the family at large. So, the therapy in Milan, so we showed up in Milan. I don't speak Italian. My husband doesn't speak Italian. So we were so fortunate that there were interpreters available, translators. They could explain to us what the paper was saying before we signed it. Now, I'm happy that there are CPPs now. I'm happy that there are French ethics committees, because it's not okay to sign a piece of paper when you don't understand what it says. It's important that our rights as patients and as caregivers be protected. Last point, access to care. We were fortunate we don't speak Italian, but we do speak English. We love spaghetti, so Milan was great. Great destination. But put yourself in the shoes of parents who don't travel much, who don't speak any foreign language. How do you spend 4 months in a different country? How do you drop everything? Because obviously we got jobs. How do you give up on your job overnight? It's a huge source of stress. So it's really important to have access to care locally. It's important not to have to travel to a different country to get that care. It helps you withstand everything that goes on. By way of conclusion, a parent will do anything to save their children, but for that we need information and we need assistance. We need help understanding what it is that we're committing to. So we need objective, quantified information on paper, because when people tell us orally, we can take notes, but there's so much going on and it's an emergency. It's difficult to write it all down, and it's difficult to actually have the brain space to make the right decisions. And also the feedback. It's important to have feedback. And to finish on a positive note, Colin went to kindergarten for the first time in early September. She's blending in with the classroom. She's happy. She has vocabulary. She's self-confident. So yes, her balance is a little off. She has a little trouble walking, but she's so full of life and she's determined and she has the same life as any other 3-year-old. So thank you, Ella. Thank you, Florence.
Non, mais moi, je suis effectivement... je suis parent moi-même et à chaque fois que j'entends
I have children myself.
témoignages, évidemment, c'est à la fois
And when I hear
bouleversant
those stories,
et, comme vient de le dire Florence, plein d'espoir
it's
pour les
heartbreaking,
enfants qui ont pu être traités à temps.
but it's also a source of hope for those children that have been treated in time.
Le but de notre symposium aujourd'hui,
That's why we're here. That's our goal. That's what we're working on. And like I said, like we all said, it is important to have information timely, accessible, locally accessible information. Thank you, Florence. No legal or administrative system will ever replace the love of a parent. It's a gut feeling, isn't it? Parents will do anything to save their children. So I'm involved in institutional policy efforts, and I do believe that assistance needs to be provided by those bodies. It's not up to the parents to... Parents shouldn't have to wonder, or should I consent or not consent? It is important that the organization, the supervisory authority, to provide protection to patients and caregivers. And it's a good thing that we have scientific organizations that are stringent in their approach. That's the whole point of ethics. We don't want to make the decision-making process even more difficult for parents. On the contrary, it is ethical that we should make it easier. And this means practical, pragmatic help. And I'm involved in research projects, and from time to time I talk to the sponsors, the financial sponsors of the research, and I said to them, have you ever thought that over and beyond the cost of having all those medical disciplines, in addition to paying for the nurses, etc., how about chipping in for the cost of transport for the families? And I know that's thinking outside the box, and I know that it's not an obvious thing, but I think that a lot of research projects, considering the huge financial investments that they require, they can't afford to spring for the patient and their families' transport costs. So, call me an idealist. Maybe this is utopia, I don't know. But I think we need to focus on not just the science, we need to focus on non-medical benefits as well. So keep hope alive, I'm not giving up. But thank you so much for sharing your stories. Now let's hear from researchers, investigators. Are they ready? I think they are. And Jean-Hugues will go first. Take it away, Jean-Hugues. Many thanks. Many thanks to the organizers, many thanks to Ella, many thanks to the two mothers who just shared their stories. Now, interest. I have interest. I have had interest with Bluebird and also Orchard Therapeutics in the interest of transparency. And I have a conflict. I have an open conflict of interest with Bluebird, none with Orchard. I have an open conflict because the way that this company is behaving is not ethical. Those are predatory practices. I have an open conflict with Bluebird and their way of doing things. Allow me to clarify something that Guy said before. Libmeldy is a gene therapy and a cell therapy medication against MLD, and it's now available in France. It hasn't jumped through all the hoops before it gets the marketing authorization, but following the marketing authorization granted by the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, this medication was able to embark on an early access process, which is a mechanism set up by our agency, under which French children who need that drug and who qualify, who meet the requirements of the marketing authorization. Now, this medication is available in France. So much so that we have treated 3 children using that medication since the summer of 2021. Of course, this does not resolve the problems listed by Colin and Alice's mom. So, yeah. The treatment is available in Paris. It's not Milan, but it's Paris. And when you live in the south of France, for example, it's not easy to schlep all the way to Paris to get treatment. And so, yes, in the Bluebird studies, the laboratory sprang for the cost of transport for the families, but as soon as that drug is available on the market, that financial assistance stops. So the welfare system in France does allow for some support to the families, but they don't cover everything, and so things are still very difficult financially. Now, in terms of what Colin and Alice's mom was saying regarding the trial in which Alice was enrolled, she received intrathecal injections. Whether we're talking about that trial or the current trial for MLD or even Skysona for CALD, now, the benefit of those drugs is that it currently stops progression of the disease at the time of diagnosis. Unfortunately, it does not help restore lost function. So, cell and gene therapy drugs perform really well. Unfortunately, it can only stop progression of the disease and not restore lost function. When it's lost, you can't get it back. So one of the key principles of ethics, if you go back to Kant, the philosopher, you have non-maleficence and beneficence. Do no harm. And I would like to apologize to Matteo's parents because I feel that I've done them harm. In July 2021, Caroline Savin and myself did present the potential gene therapy for CALD, X-linked ALD. We did talk to those parents about this potential solution because the EMA granted the marketing authorization, and I thought that we would have access to that treatment via the mechanism that I talked about before. So during the studies, we and Caroline and myself, we needed to be neutral. And when we talked to the parents about gene therapy, we said, now in terms of CALD, there are 2 potential therapies that we know well. Allotransplant and gene therapy, and we're evaluating that, and we don't know which is best. So Caroline and I treated 6 children against that backdrop, and every time we were neutral in what we were saying to them. Now, for Matteo's parents, the marketing authorization had been granted. Public authorities had recognized the treatment as being effective. And so we decided to let it rip a little bit, and we said, Matteo is going to have access to that treatment. And 2 months later, we had to renege on our promise because Bluebird had withdrawn from the markets. So if I had to do things over, I would not have told Matteo's parents about this. What we did to Matteo and Matteo's parents is disgusting. We gave them false hope, represented them with a solution, and that solution disappeared 2 months later. So it's not our fault, but I feel responsible, and I am so sorry. Matteo's lucky. Well, this is what happened next. Allotransplantation was a possibility, and as the mom rightly said, this was a difficult journey. It's particularly difficult for Matteo, but you need to keep a cool mind. We could not have foretold what Matteo's journey would have been following an allotransplant. We cannot know what the journey of the patient will be after cell and gene therapy.
So we are dealing with incredibly aggressive diseases that could lead to death. And we have in our hands drugs that were approved, but were approved after clinical trials on very few patients. When it comes to ALD, it's only 65 patients that were treated in the world. And when it comes to MLD, it's even fewer patients. And every time we are taking a bet, we are trying to put the child's best interest forward. This is what we are aiming for. But each child has their own story when it comes to treatment, and we cannot predict what will happen. I also wanted to touch upon something that was said by the mother of Colleen and Alice. When she said, I don't really know what I signed at the bottom of the sheet because it was all in Italian. Well, the diagnostic of such a disease completely uproots your family and changes your family. It's devastating. But it could be done in French. Between what you hear as parents, between what we say as professionals, between what we write as professionals, and between what you understand as parents, we are speaking the same language, but we hear and understand different things, even in French. And I would like to mention a story. It's a very sad story of a child who died after an allotransplant. And the father told me that he was told that his daughter was never at risk. But I had said it, and I also had written it in the papers that I hand to the family. But this father was convinced that I had never said it, and he wasn't of bad faith, but he simply did not want to hear it. And if you hear it, at that time, you cannot move forward. So you simply push it aside. You don't hear it. And so us professionals, health professionals, we have to be supported by patients' association and patients' groups. This is why you have to be sitting around the table with us. Whatever the good intentions of people, when a family has to go through such a devastating situation, an unimaginable situation, well, there is so much we can understand and so much we can hear from professionals. Sometimes we simply shut down and don't hear what's being said. It's simply normal. So there's not a good way and a bad way of doing things. There is not a good reaction and a bad reaction, but sometimes there are bad stakeholders. Thank you, Jean-Hugues. It's difficult to take the floor after all of you. But when we talk about the table, when we talk about defining common rules, it's very interesting because this question of information is key. We all have a sad story. I don't want to make you cry, but I carry out autopsies on children. It's part of my job. And all the processes that are put in place are necessary, but they will never be enough. We have to remind ourselves of that. It will never be enough. And this pushes us to do more. Of course, in clinical trials, there are processes put in place to support family, but we always want more. And when it comes to ethics as well, and what's positive, is that there's equality between all of us. Of course, the suffering of a caretaker isn't the same as the suffering of a family member, the suffering of a health professional, as that of a parent, but we do have to say that we are all not satisfied with the situation. And sometimes we have to criticize the behavior of people who behaved badly. I think doing so is very brave. And I repeat this to parents all the time. If you start speaking up, if you point out what's wrong, then the situation will evolve. In democratic countries, these countries evolve because people spoke up. You have to speak up, you have to discuss, you have to denounce bad situations, and maybe one day the parents that are present will say, at least I hope so, because I'm an idealist, parents will be able to say that they were actors of a revolution that will happen in 20 or 30 years. I'm completely convinced of that. I think we are in the depth of the ethical discussion right now, but when it comes to Ella, we have to write things down, because then we forget what we are saying. And there are key aspects that we have to take into account. The responsibility of actors. When it comes to helping parents, is it enough just to hand them written reports, etc., etc.? There's many questions, and the topic of this symposium today is to create a charter. So we have to write things down. This is how we will move forward towards putting together this charter. Sorry, I was a bit long. We will now listen to our other colleague. I'm sure it will be very moving. We cannot hear you. Elise, I don't know if I need to do anything for translation. I haven't done anything. I don't know if I need to do anything. No, it's okay. I think if you just speak, then it should work. All right, great, thank you. We can see your slideshow, but it is not in full screen. It's at the bottom of the screen, if you want to put it in full screen. Thank you very much. So I am I work in neuropediatrics, and I work at the Leukodystrophy Reference Center. I know many of the participants who've spoken today, and I really wanted to thank Mrs. Jourdan for her for speaking up. It was moving, and I know that you're very strong. I know that Matteo is also a very strong boy, and it moved me. I also wanted to thank Madame Bignet, Mrs. Bignet, for talking about Alice and Colline. Now, I do not follow these children, but I was involved. And I think that the stories of these two mothers are really hit close to home. It is what we live as health professionals. Now, Jean-Hugues Dalle earlier spoke about Matteo and his parents, and I completely agree with Jean-Hugues. It was a dramatic situation, and we were in part responsible because we announced a treatment that in the end could not be carried out. And when it comes to Alice and Colline, it's also a dramatic and very sad story. it was a very difficult time post-diagnostic, especially when you have two children who are at different stages of the disease, one for which there is a treatment that will help her, but for which there are not sufficient results, even for us doctors, a treatment for which we cannot give pertinent information to the parents, and the difficulty to go to Italy to receive treatment in very far remote institutions from France. So when it comes to these treatments, there are very few centers, of course. What? Is anybody speaking? Is someone taking the floor? No? Well, in just a few minutes, I wanted to mention a few aspects of these new treatments. So, of course, there are new sources of hopes, but also new challenges. I am a doctor, and so we have challenges at the hospital. I'm not talking about the situation at the hospital, but we face difficult situations when it comes to these diseases that are currently outside the framework and for which they aren't treatments, or up till now there were no treatments that have to be carried out very early on, even before symptoms appear. So at our level as doctors, our challenge is to strengthen screening and to push for more screening, for newborn screening, and to also inform families about diagnostics, to tell families that it is possible to screen for this disease before symptoms appear, that we have to do it. And it is very difficult. It is difficult to follow up on these, to follow these patients, to have a real follow-up in the different centers. There needs to be the right coverage over all the country when it comes to screening. Of course, tests cannot be done in all cities. It's simply not possible. But once a treatment is made available, we should make sure that all families have a local access to treatment. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us. And there's also, the system is also blocked. Putting in place clinical trials takes a very long time. It is very cumbersome. There are right reasons for that and wrong reasons for that. We can talk about it, but setting up a clinical trial from the clinical trial to the treatment being made available, timeframes are simply too long. And some of these treatments are not available in France. And this is a fault in the system, because there are certainly very good treatments, but that simply cannot be done in France for financial reasons. Some laboratories are taking into account transport costs, etc., for clinical trials. But when you take part in a clinical trial, whether you take part in it yourself or your children, you have to pay for it. We have talked about accessibility in France and the fact that it's not equal for all, and I do have to say that it is true. Now, outside of France, especially in developing countries, it is a completely different story. So for now, we only have 2 new treatments, and these treatments can be done at the early onset of the disease. So for less than 10% of patients, only under 10% of patients can have access to these treatments. Haven't actually calculated the official numbers, but diagnostic is a big issue. The time between when the symptoms appear and diagnostic is too long. So the majority of patients, even for diseases for which we have a treatment available, do not have access to treatment. So then there were questions that were being raised by Ella, and I was asked to discuss the talks between parents and doctors. So it's very difficult. We have already mentioned it. It's difficult when the child can benefit from a treatment, but it's even more difficult when the child cannot have access to certain treatments. And so there's lots of hope after the first doctor's visit, and then a feeling of anger, a feeling of injustice that has been mentioned by certain families. Families go look for treatment in other countries, including treatments that haven't been authorized yet, and treatments that are costly that you have to pay for. So information about these treatments, whoever you are, whether you're media, associations, an actor of the industry, etc., you mustn't give false hope about these treatments. When you're giving out information, do not give false hope. So does the fact that there are new treatments out there change the way the diagnostics is announced? Well, when you share the diagnostic, it is always devastating because these are rare diseases that can lead to death. And of course, a treatment available can be a source of hope, but it is only available for very few children. And these treatments are very long and heavy, long processes. And so at the end of the visit, when you can tell the parents that we can put in place therapy with that has shown good results, it's a good thing. But we don't have hindsight yet. We don't know what will happen in the long term. But of course, it's a source of hope to know that there are treatments out there, and these visits, the ones where you announce that there is a treatment available, are very different from the ones when you have to say that sadly for the parents and the child in your doctor's office, there will not be a treatment available because the disease has already evolved too much and too rapidly. So we all have to improve as doctors, but all of us have to improve. The reference center of doctors have to improve to better diagnostics and have quicker diagnostics. So, and we also have to shorten the time frame between diagnostic and treatment. And Jean-Hugues knows about this as well. He is currently trying to put together a gene. He was talking about gene therapy and protocols, and he is trying to put that in place. And he is doing everything that he can to speed up this process. So we mostly talk about children, but these treatments also include and involve adults. And these treatments for serious forms of the disease are usually available very early on, but we also must work for adults as well. And parents know this well as well. It's too long for parents to have access to treatments, because there are treatments that are currently trying to get their market authorization and so we have to tell parents that we have to wait, and telling parents that they must wait is simply awful, simply unimaginable to have to wait. And I believe there are differences between different countries. I did mention it earlier. And in France, it's particularly slow. I'm not saying that it's better elsewhere, but we need to simplify the process. And simplifying it doesn't mean making it more risky. And the aim of this symposium is, and the goal of this symposium is to inform about ethics, of course. But what parents are asking for, what families are asking for, in the end, is to simplify this process for things to go faster. And I am simply convinced that it doesn't have to be more risky just because it is quicker. So this was a very general presentation, but we all need to discuss more, exchange information. We are not we're not fighting, we're in this together. We have to move together. Thank you. Now, Caroline, after handing over the floor, I will hand over the floor to the participants, but your presentation was very interesting, and you talked about simplifying the processes and maybe being less rigorous when you simplify it. I think we can work faster and even better. And their process, it actually shows that the slower you are, the worse that you are, because then you're not efficient. And you lose on efficacy and efficiency because you're too slow. This is quite a philosophical and political question, but it is important to pinpoint this and to mention it and to talk about it to policymakers and other actors, because they are not always fast and they often lack rigor. And now I will hand over the floor to my colleagues from the different companies present here today. But before that, I did have a comment about time frames, and time frames make people suffer more. There are many studies about access to treatment that show that people hate having to wait and being left without information, no matter the diagnostic. They hate waiting and not being told what's going on. Now, I will now hand over the floor to my colleagues from the industry, and even people who are putting out products onto the market have also been through periods of suffering. As you said, we're not fighting one another. We all want to move together and evolve together. Now I will hand over the floor to Pascal Vincendon. Now you can tell me what the right order is. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I wanted to warmly thank Ella. Thank you for having invited us. Thank you for having invited Orchard Therapeutics. We want to take part in multi-party discussions, and often we're not invited because we represent private companies, and sometimes talks are only amongst universities and doctors. These are points of view. Now, my name is Pascal Vincendon. I worked for Orchard's Therapeutics, and I had several units, and I had the French unit. I have been in France for more than 3 years now. I will now put up my slides. I hope you can hear me okay. And I assume that I have to share my screen. So I will do that now. Just give me a few seconds. So sorry, this is a little bit complicated, but I am hoping to show my slides, but the buttons keep disappearing. So you should be able to see my PowerPoint now. Sorry, I apologize. So, Orchard's Therapeutics is a quite young laboratory. It was funded in 2015, and three doctors, decided to work together. Two researchers in the UK and one in the US. And Bobby Gaspard has been working for more than 20 years on gene therapy on autologous ex vivo hematopoietic stem cell. And so he was one of the first ones to do so in the 1990s, and he decided to continue his work to help research industrialize drugs and also make sure that drugs are available to a majority of people in most countries around the world. So he co-founded Orchard Therapeutics in 2015 with two other researchers. So the approach at Orchard is that there are multiple gene therapy that are being developed, that have been developed in the last 30 years, but we are concentrating on hematopoietic stem cells, gene therapy, that is blood cells and bone marrow cells. We believe that our approach has clinical positive aspects and positive aspects when it comes to, for example, leukodystrophy. So hopefully my presentation will be able to answer to some of the questions that were asked by the mother of Colleen, and I want to thank her for her presentation once again. So we work with stem cells that come from the patient's own bone marrow and blood. And so this allows for a treatment that is a single treatment. And the single treatment has an impact on the rest of this patient's life. And Orchard's priority is rare diseases that need medical attention. As you can see on this slide, this is what we call the pipeline. That is all of the products that are currently being developed in the laboratory. So, for financial reasons, we had to lower the number of products that we are developing, and we had to stop investing in immunodeficiency. But we are trying to find partners in order to develop these products as part of partnerships. So we have decided to concentrate on neurometabolic and neurodegenerative diseases. That includes metachromatic leukodystrophy. And this is the first treatment that will be that has been put out onto the market. And we are also developing other products that are in the clinical trial phase in very early stages. And hopefully these will have positive aspects, especially when it comes to rare diseases. So this is the gene therapy approach. It's very personalized. So this is a chart that shows you what will happen to a patient and his or her family, as was said by Colleen's mother. So stem cells are collected at the hospital from the patient's blood or bone marrow. Then the patient goes back to his or her house, and the cells are then transported. The cells are transported at the factory. Then they are genetically modified. We inject the corrected cell in the cells of the patient. Then there's quality control and other checks. Then the cells are frozen, and they're sent back to a treatment site. So this allows us to have treatment being done in different countries and not just in Italy. Indeed, it was developed in Italy first.
You have to understand that this intersection in green The entire process for manufacturing the product actually takes 2 months in order to ensure proper safety and security. Then the patient goes back to hospital, receives a conditioning regimen of chemotherapy, and then again can receive his own cells. So the patient receives an infusion of his own cells. So with this type of gene therapy, and again, this is cell therapy at the end of the day, over and beyond manipulating the delivery system that carries a dedicated therapeutic element, there's a lot of logistics involved for each patient, for each procedure in particular. Now, MLD, metachromatic leukodystrophy, that is our topic today. It is a rare disease, and the incidence is very low. So, clearly, there are very few patients who have the disease. And the current MLD treatment only covers part of the medical need. It was developed for the most severe and the earliest onset forms of the disease, before the age of 6. And we've been able to measure, by supporting projects, ELA projects in particular, and also thanks to a call for volunteers via the Connect platform, we've been able to appreciate the fact that this disease means a huge burden for the family, both financial and emotional. And there's also an impact that you cannot quantify. When you lose a child, how can you put a price on that? So, the goal is to change the lives of children who are eligible for the treatment, who have been diagnosed in time, and who have an early form of the disease. And this is a unique treatment. Jean Hugdal rightly said that we've been through every step of the clinical development process, and it's a very long process for rare diseases. In order to enroll a sufficient number of patients to demonstrate that the drug works, it takes several years, contrary to different other diseases that are more frequent in the population. Now, there are to get a cohort of 21 patients, it took 8 years to enroll them, and then you have to follow up for 2-3 years. That was the requirement for providing or submitting the application to the authorities and then to the EMA. That took 1 more year, and then after more than 10 years of clinical development, finally, and we were very happy and relieved, we received the EMA approval on December 17th, 2020. So against this backdrop, little Colin received that treatment for compassionate use before the treatment was actually approved. And this is why the document was in Italian. It takes a while. It takes a while for the documents to become available and translated into different language. That only happens after approval of the drug. And we understand how difficult a period that was for both the child and her parents. So the EMA indication for this treatment for patients who have been diagnosed as having a leukodystrophy, a confirmed diagnosis for leukodystrophy, well, they need to have a very early onset form, so either a late infantile or early juvenile form of the disease. That is before the age of 7, and so the indication over and beyond the patients who did not develop symptoms yet and who could be treated in time before the disease appeared, because we included in the trial early juvenile patients. So this means patients as young as 6, we were able to show a benefit. Obviously, that's harder to achieve because the client already had symptoms initially, but this still made it possible to see an actual benefit from the drug. And so the EMA covered this indication for this section of the population, late infantile, early juvenile, assuming that you can catch it before cognitive decline and while the children can still walk without help or unassisted. Now, it is important for the treatment to be administered as part of a qualified treatment center following a certification process. After obtaining the EMA approval, well, we travel from one country to another within the EU, and we hope to travel even further. The goal is to get approval from the healthcare authorities in all those countries. But the next step, and this is true, it's a long process, and we too hope to shorten it in the future. You need to negotiate reimbursement of the drug because we need healthcare authorities to reimburse the drug so we can continue to invest into that drug, cover the cost of research, cover the investments made by investors, and cover a lot of different costs that we have incurred. What can we tell you at this juncture? Well, Libmeldy is reimbursed in some countries. Now, in some countries of Europe where we currently operate, we have agreements with the NHS in the UK, with LISA in Italy, and the GKBSV authority in Germany. And those were important milestones in our journey. And believe this is also important for leukodystrophy children who are eligible for the treatment, for their caregivers, and also for the medical community. Under those agreements, particularly the UK agreement followed by the Italian agreement, we're able to achieve reimbursement of the treatment at a price that meets the laboratory's requirement, that enables it to continue to operate as a going concern. So Germany was the third EU country that approved the drug and validated the reimbursement scheme for this therapy, and therefore recognized the value that Libmeldy represents, and also its clinical impact and the benefit that this represents for patients. So, in terms of the qualified treatment centers, QTCs, this is where we stand. We understand how difficult it is for patients to travel, and while developing the treatment, we chose Italy because at the very beginning, the researchers who developed that gene therapy in their laboratory worked at the San Raffaele Hospital in Milan, and they worked with the Italian telethon called TGET. So the entire development work was done in partnership between this team of researchers and the San Raffaele Institute in Milan, and also the Orchard Therapeutics company. It all started in 2015. So patients had to travel because initially the treatment was based on fresh cells. We could not freeze them yet. And then gradually there were scientific developments, and we started cryogenizing the cells after they had been genetically modified. And this made it possible to contemplate the setting up of QTCs in other countries. So now we have qualified treatment centers in Paris at the Robert Debré Hospital. You have an entire medical team there that are treating physicians who perform transplants, Professor Jean-Luc Dalle, and also neuropediatricians such as Caroline Serra. We also have a treatment center in Utrecht, in the Netherlands, in Manchester, in the UK, and in Germany as well. And very soon we'll have treatment centers in Spain and Sweden. Now those treatment centers, we can't have a gazillion of them, simply because the process is very cumbersome. You need to ensure consistency and quality of the treatment. And because patients are so rare, How do you maintain qualification? See the qualification process on the screen? At the moment, we've managed to shorten it, but it took us 2 years initially before we could set up the first centers. And now we try to shorten that time span to 6 months. And obviously, in terms of evaluation, you need discussions, you need a partnership agreement. In order to set up the audits, you need documents. You need to document the procedure. Hospitals, they know how to do their job. And we need to provide documents to the healthcare authorities. We need to tell them exactly what we're doing, with whom and where. I apologize. I'm sorry for being the bad guy here, because what you're telling us is absolutely fascinating. But could you speed up a notch? Just for the families, everybody's home and they got family constraints. Oh, okay. I'll talk even faster. Okay, so the Transparency Committee in France actually fast-track evaluation of the clinical data. And so the Transparency Committee approved the drug in April 2021, reduced the indication to pre-symptomatic patients. So the therapy, the cost of that therapy for those patients is covered in France. And at the moment, we're negotiating reimbursement with the CEPS, the Economic Committee for Healthcare Products, and we're hoping to find an agreement. In the meantime, and it's a great thing in France that the French healthcare system actually allows that. The French healthcare system recognizes when it's an imperative need of the patient, and so early access is possible since October last year. That way, we get to treat patients in France, as Jean-Hugues Glad rightly said. And that's it for me. That's it for me for now. I hope I have shed light over our point of view as a laboratory. Thank you very much, Pascal. Stay with us, please. We're going to have questions, I'm sure. Now, we call those stakeholders institutional stakeholders because it's the buzzword, but I'm sure that after we hear everybody, we'll have questions for you. Now, handing over to Valérie Denux, head of the EU Affairs and Innovation. While preparing for today's symposium, we decided it would be a good idea to discuss functions, skills, competences, but also do it at the EU level. Because if we summarize patient expectations, and that's why we're here today, obviously, the lead times is something that we need to discuss. And also, where you live is important. We may all be EU citizens, but we wonder why those processes aren't standardized from one EU country to another. So, Valérie, are you here? Yes, I am. Thank you so much for being here today on a Saturday afternoon, late afternoon, if I might add. It's my pleasure. I find it so interesting to hear those different points of view. I think that we need a multidisciplinary approach. We're all here to serve the patient, and there's a long chain of different stakeholders. It's important for us to understand each other well and dovetail together. Can you see my presentation? Yes, we can. My name is Valérie Denux. I'm a doctor myself. Okay, I thought I'd mention it. Let's not lose sight of our main goal, and that's our patients. And obviously, it's always a very emotional moment for me hearing the parents speak, because you really put things back into perspective, isn't it? I'll go quickly. I'll have to shorten my presentation, so I don't want to overlap with everything that the other speakers have said, so I'll make it quicker than planned. Let me try and explain a little bit what the ANSM does. We try to improve access to therapeutics, including gene therapies. The ANSM stands for the French National Agency for Medicines and Health Products Safety. So that's step one. I'll explain why and how, but the idea is for ANSM ANSM to fast track and support development and availability of innovative health products, because we know expectations are high and there are a lot of unmet medical needs or medical needs that are insufficiently or unsatisfactorily met. So we're talking about breakthrough products, products that are entirely new, or incremental improvements to existing products, existing drugs. So we're a little surprised every time to hear that in the area of pediatrics, there are lots of off-label uses of drugs simply because that particular drug doesn't cater to the specific needs of children. No, the idea is to support innovation from the get-go, from the very beginning of the process. Our agency opened up to that kind of thing 2 years ago. We used to do it informally, and now we do it formally. Now, more and more decisions are made collegially at the EU level, which lightens our workload. We're not responsible for the final decision. And so we're here to support the development of those new products from the very beginning. So research can provide early advice. The GIO is the Innovation and Guidance Office. So it can provide early advice during research with academics, but also other sponsors, whoever they are. And as part of preclinical trial phases, we provide scientific opinions if we are a little ahead of the curve, and we can also organize pre-submission meetings. So we're going to work on the application before the clinical trial, because the more mature it is, the faster it will be authorized, and the fewer significant changes there will be. So you achieve a more effective clinical trial, and you get the outcome much faster. In terms of clinical trials, during that phase, as you will see later, we're moving towards EU-level clinical trials because regulation has changed. So France can be the reporter and can support the sponsor so that the application will be approved as quickly as possible. We also organize evaluation plans when there's a request for market authorization for products that are meant for adults. To what extent can we adapt them to cater to the needs of children? Once again, pediatrics is seen as the poorest member of the family because we're talking small cohorts, and it's a major risk, obviously, to children. So the idea is to promote development of those drugs for children. And every time we work with the CPP ethics committees, as part of clinical trials, we also work with patient groups and external experts, such as professors, who focus specifically on clinical aspects. And we also do this as part of pivot studies that will lead to a marketing authorization. Following the marketing authorization, obviously, we make sure we keep vigilant and make sure that there are no post-marketing incidents for the drug. Now, the GIO, the Innovation and Guidance Office, is not meant for healthcare professionals or patients, unless they're academics and involved in research. So it's a streamlined and easy process. It's accessible on our website, and you get to ask any question you have. Now, we're not here to do the work instead of them, but we're here to help them in terms of the scientific and regulatory process. Now, what's our scope? As I said before, scientific opinions, regulatory support, pre-submissions. Obviously, we have to prioritize our work. We cannot spread ourselves too thin and cater to every single product. This is part and parcel of what we're discussing today. We're talking about unmet medical needs, rare diseases to a large extent, and there are subtypes of diseases. In cancer, for example, cancerology, there are subtypes of cancer, and this means even smaller cohorts. And those subtypes of cancer with such small cohorts can qualify as rare diseases. And then, of course, pediatric development, as I said before, and all of the breakthrough therapies, innovative therapies. Obviously, we give preference to France, first and foremost, because we're talking unmet public health needs, but because we work in close collaboration with other EU countries, we collaborate at that level. So we provide support to startup companies, academics, French SMEs, and other industry players that may not be French, but who are planning development work in France. For example, they're planning to conduct clinical trials in France. Now, the challenge is to promote clinical trials in France. There's a new regulation that came into force to harmonize the rules for clinical trials throughout Europe, throughout the EU. There are upsides, both for sponsors and for patients, as you will see. Now, a quick aside, if I may. In terms of clinical trials for rare diseases, they account for 22% of all clinical trials. We can do better than 22%. 80% are early phase. Unfortunately, only 20% of those move on to phase 2 or 3. This means that after the early phase, there's a high rate of failure. So 75% of that population are children, and in France, 8% of clinical trials are conducted in the early phase. So it's not a lot. So we are trying to change that. Things are slightly better when it comes to phase 2 and 3, which account for 14 to 44% of clinical trials. So obviously these are clinical trials conducted by industry, but I don't have specific figures regarding the other clinical trials from academics, etc. So why is it a good thing for patients? Number one, the peer approach is promoted. We put more brains together. We bring more expertise to the table. It's always better to share our skills, our experience, our know-how. And also, this means wider integration of data, and all of that data will be shared. And also, the clinical teams are larger, which means it can cross-reference all of that information. Also, this strengthens surveillance, coordination of surveillance of clinical trials, and also the resulting data. It's also a winning situation for sponsors. Why? Because it's easier to conduct clinical trials in different EU countries if things are harmonized from one country to another. And obviously, expertise is pooled, and ethics committees can discuss ethical aspects from one country to another. And also, the results will be shared widely between researchers and sponsors. Needless to say, this fast-tracks the whole process, the whole research process. Now, those benefits obviously do not call into question the fact that the final say, that the country has the final say. France has the final say in terms of deciding whether or not this clinical trial will take place on French soil, obviously, because we do have non-negotiable rules. Now, the ANSM speaks for France, but obviously we cannot go against the CPP Ethics Committee when it comes to the ethical aspects of clinical trials. As I said before, we serve as a reporter. The sponsor, it's up to them actually, they can request that France be the reporter, and so we provide that assistance. I'm almost done. In terms of derogations or special dispensations, so we have set up the GIO, the Innovation and Guidance Office, to support the sponsors. We have a clinical trial office, and we also have an office for deviations or dispensations. I'm not going to go into detail in terms of the in terms of this, but you have special access for compassionate reasons, so individual by individual, and then you have early access. What does this mean? Because the product is currently being developed in France, and so the ANSM and the HAS, the top French authority in France, jointly decided to make that product available to specific individuals before the marketing authorization is actually awarded, or after, within 3 months, that is right after the marketing authorization. And also, in terms of doing this for compassionate use, and I'm speaking to healthcare professionals and also the parents of the children, very often you have situations where, this is ramping up actually. We've gone from 25,000 in 2019, if I remember correctly, 28,000 25,000 compassionate uses to 65,000 special access for compassionate use. So these are specifically, this access is specific to one particular point, an individual. The treatment may not be available in France, may be available in the other country, including the US. And if the laboratory agrees to make that product available, and there's a hospital in France that requests it, then we carry out a study in order to provide very early access to the drug for compassionate use, particularly in case of a therapeutic stalemate. So this is a decision that is made by the healthcare professional, who's the prescriber, and the ANSM agency that evaluates the data available, the parents, and then, of course, the patients who potentially agree to using that product, which has not fully completed the whole development cycle. So the ANSM supports development of innovations in connection with users, patients, healthcare professionals, and CPP ethics committees. So what are the drivers? The GIO, the Innovation and Guidance Office, but also France is the vice chair of the PETCO, the EU-level pediatric group. And very recently we became the vice chair of this group. And we do a lot of pediatric investigation plans. We have clinical trials, and gradually they're being harmonized at EU level. We're supporting that as much as we can. We have special access mechanisms. We have late access mechanisms as well. But thanks to early access and compassionate access, we have ways of fast-tracking the process. Also, real-life data is quite the challenge. So early access and clinical trials obviously are key to produce data and evaluations as quickly as possible, and also safely, because that is our goal. Thank you very much. That's it for me, and I try to speak as quickly as possible. But that was very clear. Thank you so much. Stick around for the discussion. A quick segue. We want to tell the families that there are multiple stakeholders. The ANSM has its own scope of work, but there are other stakeholders involved, obviously. Now, speaking for the families, allow me to challenge you. Why take those individual measures for compassionate use and save one patient or help one patient when the product is already available to the whole population in other countries? I feel that we're still lagging behind. At the EU level, we're still in limbo. If you put yourself in the patient's shoes, how can you possibly understand why access is so disparate, so different from one country to another? Why access is so different from one country to another? Allow me to quickly answer that one. Clearly, there's a long-standing belief. There's a lot of deep-rooted, long-standing beliefs in France that are, die-hard beliefs, and that we're doing things better than others. No, I'm not one of those people. Good for you. Now, what I'm saying is that in terms of clinical trials, France is a leading country when it comes to non-industry clinical trials. We are number 3 when it comes to industry clinical trials. We are number 1 when it comes to non-investigational trials. So we're doing pretty well. We're pretty good. Now, if you look at the time frame, and obviously this is an objection that we hear time and time again, we find that the methods are different one country to another. But in terms of access to products, at the end of the day, what does it matter for the patient? Whether it's via a market authorization with immediate reimbursement, or whether it's compassionate access, it doesn't matter. But the time frame is the same from one country to another. We compared ourselves with Germany. We thought they're much faster than we are. No, they're not. We're pretty much at the same pace. Same thing with Spain. So yeah, the procedures may be different, the framework may be different, true. There's no way around that. But, there's gradual harmonization. And at EU level, other EU countries are actually following suit. They're mimicking our special dispensation process. Now, like I said, I'm advocating for patients. I'm speaking for the patients. So there are other mechanisms that you presented, and because they're not available in France, they may not be known to our listeners. So if at the end of the day we manage to achieve what you described, that is ensuring the same level of access for patients so that they can be treated as they would in other countries. Good, but thank you for describing all of that, because the general public may not be familiar with those developments in other countries. It could be a good time to hand over to the next speaker, who will explain what the transparency is and what the HAS, top French healthcare authority, is and what it does. Now, we'll discuss the Economic Committee for Healthcare Products, but it's important to describe to the families how this is all organized. Etienne, over to you.
I see hands raised. Maybe we can answer a few questions first, or should we wait for the speakers? No, we will go straight to the presentation by Etienne Langlini, and then we will give the floor to participants later. Can you hear me okay? Yes, Etienne, we hear you perfectly. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having invited me here today. I was present during a lot of the discussion that took place this afternoon. It was very rich debates. It's very interesting to hear the voices of different stakeholders. It's very rare, and we have to put an emphasis on that and highlight that. And I believe that Ella played a key role, and that the symposium was key. Now I will try to be quick so that then we can move on to a debate. And I did want to explain what the role of the top health authority in France is and what the role of the Transparency Commission is. So I am Etienne Langlini, I am a doctor, and I am Vice President of the Transparency Commission at the HAS, the top health French authority. So I have no interest or conflicts of interest with the pharmaceutical industry. So as was said, the process for drugs is very long. It starts with a patent and then preclinical trials, then clinical trials, which have different phases of study. And then this all ends in a phase 3 study that compares a new treatment with the reference treatment or routine care for a certain disease to prove that a new treatment has positive aspects for people with a disease. Then we move on to another process, which is all very administrative, and it is not very well known. It is also very long. Whether it be the marketing authorization or the actual commercialization of the product. So the Transparency Commission plays a role after a drug has obtained a marketing or a market authorization. So the Transparency Commission is a commission that assesses from a scientific and medical point of view the drugs that obtained marketing authorization to understand and to assess if this drug should be reimbursed by the National Health Insurance Fund, meaning by each and every one of us. And so this is not a decision, this is only an opinion. And to write this opinion, we will evaluate data that is given to us by industry and that ask for a reimbursement. And then this opinion will be given to the CEPS, and the CEPS, the Health Products Economic Committee, is in charge of negotiating the price of the drug, so that then the drug can be put out onto the market. So I will follow up on what my colleagues from INSM said. There is early access, and we are involved in these early access authorizations, even before marketing authorization, that is. So what do we do at the Transparency Commission? Well, just like every other commission and agency that assess technologies, we try to collect data on the positive aspect of a drug. Is a drug better? Is this new drug better than what has been given up until now to the same patients that are suffering from a disease? And to compare routine care to a new treatment, we need data. It's not always very easy to understand because there are many different challenges. There are certain agencies that assess risk and not the strategy of a drug. So the health agencies are currently very in fashion right now, and they are the ones that assess risk and benefit. In fact, in the US, there's been works about this, and in Europe soon this assessment will change. Currently, this assessment is being done by each country in which there is a national health insurance fund. So first, what we will assess is the usefulness of the disease based on the seriousness of the disease, whether it is a curative or just a treatment. What are the actual benefits of this, the actual clinical benefit of a treatment? So sometimes it's easy to compare, but sometimes there's already drugs available out on the market, and so we have to compare the new treatment to to the ones that are already available. So we have to measure clinical added value, and we gave a grade. We analyze whether or not we have data that show that this new drug shows progress compared to other treatment already available. It can go to from major progress, important, to moderate, to lack of progress. And to assess this, we base ourselves on studies that are being carried out and study that compare the new treatment to routine care. It can be a direct comparison, or it can be, in other situations, different kinds of comparison, because sometimes it's difficult to carry out a direct comparison, especially when it comes to rare diseases and very serious diseases. Because then you would compare a new treatment to palliative care, and that's very difficult ethically. And so there are lots of indirect comparisons, and we are currently debating about how to assess these different comparisons. So we assess what is interesting for the patient, what the effect of the treatment will have. Is it an effect on lifespan? Is it an effect on health in general? And then we also assess the importance and the need for this disease, for this drug. And depending on the grade that we give, then it will be authorized for reimbursement. Reimbursement will be authorized. And it depends on prices. It's quite a shame, quite a pity that our colleague from the Economic Committee for Healthcare Products is not able to be here today. But because they determine price of products, but the grade that we give is what leads to a drug being reimbursed or not. So Libmeldi obtained an ASMR 3, and so there was a framework agreement between the CEPS and the companies, which stated that the price, that there should be a similar price at the European level, a cap at European level. And there's an agreement between 5 different European countries. This allows for quicker negotiations, and when there's a lower ASMR grade, that means this has no benefit for our system. So I will be very quick. What are the challenges and issues currently? So these are the same ones for all health technology agencies. Of course, there's a very high demand from society and industry for quicker development of drugs so that more patients can benefit from drugs that show that they're useful even before having gone through all of the steps of research and having gone through phase 3 of research, which compares a new treatment to routine care. So many new mechanisms have been put into place in the US, in Europe, to improve access to marketing authorizations even before phase 3 studies. This is actually the majority of the cases. So these are data from America, but it's about the same in Europe. It's around 50%. 50% of marketing authorization are obtained even without a phase 3 study. And so we do not know if the drug is better than existing drugs. And so sometimes there are comparisons with historical cohorts that are done, because it is very hard to choose between a new drug and routine care. There's also another challenge, which comes to the criterion that we base ourselves on. Sometimes we see this a lot in cancer studies. Sometimes the criterion are pertinent for patients or are not pertinent for patients. For example, when it comes to cancer studies, as I've said, one of the criterion is the diminution of the tumor, but we know that the diminution of the tumor is not necessarily directly linked to remission or death in cancer patients. And so this is a criterion that is not useful to assess a certain drug. And then there are other challenges. It's been said and said again today, challenges when it comes to information given out to patients, because the more we the more we have information, the more we can give clear messages to patients. So I have mostly examples when it comes to cancer, but sometimes we compare certain treatments to palliative treatments, and we know that sometimes we cannot offer new treatments that we cannot offer new treatments, we cannot compare different treatments, and this has an effect on the life of patients. And so, of course, there's also another challenge, which is the welfare system, because the price that is being asked by industry is sometimes very high, and there's no real clinical positive aspect to a certain drug. So when it comes to early access, so before there we used to have 7 different mechanisms, 7 mechanisms in place, and it changed in July of 2021. It was reformed, as my colleague said, from the ANSM. Now we have 2 mechanisms, the compassionate access, and this is mostly for drugs that will not be commercialized or that are in the really early phases of development. So it's mostly for very specific cases, and they can have a positive effect for one specific patient. And then there's also the other mechanism, which is the early access for drugs that will be commercialized later on, but which allows for the drugs to be used before the drugs are given the marketing authorization, or after they are granted the marketing authorization, but before the price is set. So I did want to highlight what my colleague from ANSM said. We are really lucky to have these mechanisms in France and to have these compassionate and early access. And in France, we often say that there's very late access to treatment. But it's often when we overlook these mechanisms, because in France we can have access to a certain drug even months before a drug is authorized in the US. So this is done for patients. So what are the different criterion for early access? So we assess, so the ANSM assesses the drug depending on the clinical trials, and they also assess risk and benefit. And at the HAS, we assess other criterion. The drug has to treat a serious or disabilitating disease. The treatment needs to be, this has to be a treatment that is truly needed. There has to be a lack of treatment, and the treatment has to be innovative, meaning that this is a new type of treatment. We also need to have clinical results, so not necessarily complete results from a phase 3 clinical trial, but we do need data that show that this drug is positive. The reform that I was talking about earlier not only simplified the early access mechanisms, but also allowed us to ask for usage data or real life data. I don't really like using the word real life because clinical trials are also real life, but data that in the long term will allow us to improve scientific assessments during assessments of these products. So I didn't want to say what my colleagues, repeat what my colleagues said, but I did want to explain what the Transparency Commission is. So we are not the ones who negotiate price. We only give a grade and an opinion based on data. So we assess the data and whether or not it is strong enough, and we assess whether or not a drug should be or not reimbursed by our National Health Service. So thank you very much. Hopefully I was quick enough. Thank you. Thank you, and thanks to the other colleague as well. I think there are many questions. I think in order to not lose time, let's move on to questions now. And there was something that was very interesting that was said. Indeed, there are doctors in these agencies. You've shown it. And even though there are financial constraints, France is lucky enough to have doctors included and involved in the regulatory processes. So maybe, Jean-Luc, I think we will give the floor to Florence Fleur first. No, of course, let's give the floor to Florence, the parents first, and then I will give you the floor, Jean-Luc. So Florence, you have the floor. Thank you very much. So I had a question. I had a question about newborn screening. We didn't talk about it a lot, but I am asking myself this question because I am concerned. So of course this is not pertinent when it comes to diseases for which there are no treatment, but for leukodystrophy there's now a gene therapy. So maybe there could be an automatic newborn screening of all children, just so that we can avoid having an Alice in each family and also save the second child. So when it comes to newborn screening, what are the constraints? Is it financial? Are there other issues and challenges? So I'm Caroline Sevin. I will answer. So first, is it justified? So yes, I do believe it is. Secondly, I will turn on the video camera, sorry. Yes, sorry, I'm very sorry. Anyways, do we have challenges in France to have these newborn screenings carried out for rare diseases, for which there is a treatment available and for which the treatment has to be carried out before the appearance of symptoms, or at least very early on. I believe that we are late compared to other countries. There are other countries in which newborns are screened for other diseases and rare diseases. That we currently have pilot studies being ran. And then I have a doctor's point of view, but then a decision has to be taken by all the different stakeholders. But there are things that are being done to obtain newborn screenings. Of course, they will not be implemented tomorrow, but hopefully it will be done soon for MLD and ALD. Now, other challenges. For these two diseases, there is a treatment from MLD. There is an innovative treatment, and for ALD, sadly, even though the gene therapy is no longer available, and because of the fact that transplant is difficult, it's still a therapy, transplant. So there could be issues, and there will be debates, not necessarily coming from us doctors, but there will be debates about how to define, depending on the genetic or biochemical marker. There will be debates about which forms of the disease the baby will develop. So if we take, for example, MLD, if we test the level of sulfatides, these checks won't necessarily tell us whether the child is going to have an early juvenile form of the disease or an adult form of the disease. And this is what is being debated. We are trying to make progress when it comes to this. Indeed, you were talking about ethical criteria, and for some, it could be an ethical criteria. But when it comes to the rationale of doing newborn screenings, of course, there's no room for questioning. I think we should do it. It might take a little bit of time, but we should do it. So when I'm saying a bit of time, I'm talking about years here, not months. But these treatments are now available, and so that means that it will speed up the entire process. And when we'll have to discuss and negotiate for screening, we will also be able to negotiate for screening for other diseases. And it could be very useful. We could screen for a whole array of different diseases. In France, we only screen for 5 diseases at birth, and in other countries much more. But thank you for your question. As I was trying to let it shine through in my presentation, we accumulate delay at every step. And so we have to work and move forward. So we have often said that there shouldn't be an early access to treatment without an early access to diagnostic. That's what's at stake here. Jean-Hugues, you had a question. Yes. Thank you. Thank you to the different speakers this afternoon. So I had a comment about what was said by Valérie Denux. So we have completely changed our relations with the ANSM and the HAS. They have considerably improved, but there are still issues with time frames. So, for example, the example of Bluebird, I criticized Bluebird earlier, and I will continue to criticize them. Bluebird said that there were unreasonable time frames in the negotiation of price, and this is how they justified them leaving the market. And so, of course, we have to take time frames into account. There are reforms, as Etienne said. So, as you know, your agencies are always being assessed, and it's important to say that now there is a very big change in these agencies. That are getting younger now. It's no longer retired doctors. It used to be, sorry that I'm saying it, but it used to be Jurassic Parks in those agencies, and only retired doctors who were far removed from the reality of day-to-day of the day-to-day medical field. And so, when it comes to assessing how a drug improves life, when it comes to the Transparency Commission, and you were talking about the ASMR, there are almost no ASMR 1 grades. And you mentioned the ASMR 3 grade for the gene therapy, meaning that it has a moderate benefit for the patient. Parents simply cannot hear that. They cannot hear that it only has a moderate benefit for patients. If we look at it from the point of view of patients and parents, we're simply left dumbfounded. Why is the grade only moderate? Why moderate? But then, from the point of view of health professionals, there's also a big ethical aspect that has to be taken into account. And the issue of public money that we want to mobilize, and what public money we want to allocate to certain diseases. And this is a debate that we will need to have over the next few years, because there are more and more demands for treatments, and sometimes there's a lack of data. But the debate that we must have is what society is ready to do and what money is society ready to put forward to reimburse certain diseases. And this has to go through Parliament. It has to go through the policymakers. Valérie is raising her hand. We will give Valérie the floor. Etienne, does Etienne want to respond? No, Etienne can respond to the question, and then Valérie will take the floor. So I only have 2 comments. It's not really an answer. It's more comments. So Etienne first and Valérie. So yes, I did want to go back to ASMR grades. So what you have to know is that the Transparency Commission assesses all drugs that ask for reimbursement. So it's not necessarily in one specific medical field, in therapeutic field. So we still give out a lot of ASMR 1 for drugs that for drugs and treatments that treat a deadly disease. So this was granted for a drug against the Ebola, for example. Ebola had a very high mortality rate, and this drug that fought Ebola was granted ASMR 1, and then there was another drug against a myelin disease which was granted ASMR 1. We still give them out. But when it comes to the level of ASMR, whether it be 1, 2, 3, it doesn't really change much when it comes to what will ensue with the negotiations. I don't think there are many people who read the opinions of the HAS, whether it is an added medical benefit 1 or added medical 2 or 3. It is true that we do give out less added medical benefit 1 and more added medical benefit 2. But for the drugs that are granted ASMR 1, they have completely transformed the medical field. And we also have to distinguish between what a treatment does and the data that we have available. And sometimes we lack data. We have questions because we sometimes have before us a treatment that will completely change the life of patients, but we only have data for a certain period of time, and we do not have data over the lifetime of the patient. And so then we don't have enough hindsight to assess the drug. And so we assess the drug on certain criterion, and we still have questions and doubts remaining. But when it comes to the agency getting younger, yes, I do agree. There's the big aspect of expertise as well. It's a very important aspect. I do have to say that we ask outside experts to assess the drugs. It's not only just the members of the Transparency Commission that assess the different treatments. Experts that have expertise in a certain disease or in a certain medical field or know a treatment very well are called upon, and we don't just do that. We don't just do this process by ourselves. We'll now move on to Valerie, and then Guy, the president of ELA, will take the floor.
We understand there are bottlenecks. We have identified them in different steps of the process. There is one important blocking point that we need to discuss: the number of investigation centers. Sometimes patient enrollment takes a long time, getting authorization for clinical trial, etc. Patient enrollment is a problem. It takes forever. Yes, we're working hard to improve our lead time and improve our approach as best we can. Secondly, there's something that is currently being developed. There are European guidelines that are being drafted as we speak regarding the holding of decentralized clinical trial. Getting back to our initial discussion with the families, when you live far from an investigation center, things are difficult. So we need to decentralize clinical trials as best we can, and obviously do medical surveillance, etc. That's how we improve access to clinical trials. Are there any questions? Or should we hand over to Guy? Because we need to bring this meeting to a close. I think a lot of people have been waiting a long time to ask their questions, so they get priority. And then I have a question on my own when everybody else is done. Do we have questions from the audience? Gérard raised his hand. Yes, hello. Congratulations to the different speakers for this quality discussion. I'm very impressed. You tell it like it is. I'm a father. I lost 2 children to MLD. Their names were Christopher and Ingrid. I have a question. And sorry for being abrupt, but that's me. How is it possible for a gene therapy which is based on French or European research? How can it possibly just up and leave, go to the US, come back to Europe with maybe 3 million euros, right? 3 million euros for that gene therapy. Now I hear what Jean-Luc Dahl said, that The bluebird has predatory practices, but we need to find solutions. The EMA, the European Medicines Agency, approved the drug. Efficacy of the product has been evaluated and found conclusive. So I'm thinking about the moms and dads who want this drug and who were promised that the drug would be part of the protocol. And then they backtracked. Sorry, actually, the drug is unavailable. Families simply cannot accept that. So how can we solve this? Grégory Montel said that it's a political issue, and I agree. The EMA gave an opinion. They backtracked on their initial decision. Why? Well, Bluebird wants 3 million euros. Clearly, that's too much. Is there any way to negotiate? I think we need political will. It's important to state that. We need to tell the French president, we need to tell other EU countries, so we can shift the lines. How come an orphan drug can up and go to the US? It's not the first time this has happened. 14 years ago, my daughter, Ingrid, was involved in a clinical trial. The initial research effort was German. There was a laboratory in Denmark called Zimmelnex, if I remember correctly. They started making that drug. 12 children were treated. They're dead now, unfortunately. And the drug was sold. So I am not saying that all laboratories are bad guys. They're the villains. We need the labs, clearly. But I'm so mad. I wish Victor Hugo to write another letter, another novel to the National Assembly, to the French House of Representatives, to simply stir things up so things will shift. How can we possibly wait longer? Today's symposium is extraordinary. You're showing, dear Guy Alba, that ever since 2005, ever since the first Ella leukodystrophy convention was held in Washington, D.C., you've shown how hard you've worked. Just recently I met with a mother in the southwest of France, and her son is 7 years old. He was supposed to be part of the protocol. He has renal insufficiency, but he's asymptomatic otherwise, and he's being treated. But things need to shift now. We simply cannot wait any longer. Etienne, Valerie, we've been asked to emulate Victor Hugo. Tall order. Now, as part of preparing for the symposium, like I said, there are things that are politically possible in terms of negotiating. The different EU member states came together to fight COVID. So they've shown that it's possible. I'm saying these things as a citizen. Yeah, but even if you're part of an international or EU institution, you still have your own point of view as a citizen. So there's a trial of strength going on. Yes, there is, of course. Let's hear from Etienne and Valerie. We'd love to hear their point of view, their institutional point of view. I hear you, sir. And you're right. We cannot allow ourselves to be taken hostage for financial considerations. I attended this meeting with several professors and gene therapy experts. They were getting together and they discussed one potential solution. How about platform, non-profit platforms? So that's not part of my scope. But I thought that was an interesting idea. to try and not be too dependent. And you've heard Mr. von Lennep, the head of Sécurité Sociale, the social insurance screen. He said that I don't want to raise you to simply see what your hand is. Now, I want to see before I pay. What about you? I'm a citizen first and foremost. That's my point of view. And there are several steps in the process where we depend on industry, whether or not they go through with their projects. Now, early access, that has to be requested by the industry player, by the lab. And there are things that are drugs that should be seen as being in the general interest, in the public interest. So why can some devices or drugs or medications not be considered as public goods, as things that are in the public interest, in the general interest? But these are thoughts that well exceed the scope of our discussion. In several countries, in many countries, there have been discussions on products against Hep C, hepatitis C. Can we not set up provisions so that we won't be overly dependent on industry? This is a complex change. There are several points in that chain where we are overly dependent on labs. And obviously, laboratories are not known for caring about the public interest first and foremost. Now, obviously, we all have our own opinion about the EU, but when it comes to energy policy, environmental policy, or healthcare policy, is there such a thing as EU-level sovereignty? Having European Union companies ensuring the sovereignty of the EU, and obviously it takes a while before politicians can build that. I guess that's the issue. When you have companies that are not in the EU, they're not on EU soil, and this leads to, well, obviously we're aware of globalization. This leads to us being dependent on other countries, non-EU countries. Now, I think we have the answer, but it is our democratic duty to put in the request. Guy, what do you think? As a subscript to what Gérard said, I think that the key issue is the elephant in the room. Valerie and Etienne have skirted around the issue, because I understand it's not part of your scope. No, the EMA at EU level, the ANSM at French level, the HAS at French level. I'm not here to assign blame, but I think the most important thing is the cost of the treatment. Here we're talking between 2 and 3 million euros. Skysona, they're asking for 3 million euros in the US. That's the core issue, okay? Let's not fool ourselves. I feel that if we could shift that price one way or the other, I'm not saying, Ms. Vincent, that laboratories absolutely have to drop their prices. If the price is justified, that's what it is. But we need to come up with solutions so as to drop those prices, because otherwise, I believe that there is no way those treatments will become widely accessible. We can never trivialize that. We want any children, all children who need those treatments to be treated. So how can we make that happen? Now, I don't have all the figures, but I do believe that France is one of the leading countries, and I think this is the first gene therapy currently available. And now we know that there are other gene therapies in the pipeline that will soon be marketed, hundreds of them, and there's no reason to think that they will be less expensive. This means over 2 million euros per dose? So I know we're not going to solve that problem today, but let's at least put the issue on the table. Once we solve the issue of price, either before the clinical trial or as the clinical trial begins, because we can have public-private partnerships, maybe not at country level, but several countries working together. That would be the right scale for addressing those topics. But we need to address the problem. Otherwise, there's going to be a growing number of claims, and we'll be the first. We'll be the first to do it, and we won't be alone. There's a real problem. Honestly, as a parent, as a representative of a patient group, I never want to hear another story like that of little Matteo. Pascal, how about you? What do you think? What is your point of view? A quick comment, if I may, regarding this discussion. Of course, I cannot speak on behalf of Bluebird Bio, and I won't, but in terms of gene therapy prices, you've quoted figures, and I think that in our discussion we need to go over and beyond the figures, over and beyond the price. A price in itself doesn't mean anything, and obviously experts are here to discuss a whole bunch of different parameters with us, for example, duration. And as the HAS representative rightly said, we need to provide evidence of the potential benefit of the drug. There's another parameter that is often under-discussed: the number of patients who can be treated, and the pressure this means, the pressure exercised by each gene therapy on the public health system. Now, taking MLD by way of example, when it comes to France, in terms of potentially treating all eligible patients, we're talking 3 patients a year. It's a very small population. Now, if we look at the national effort, the country effort for addressing that pathology, very different than other diseases. In oncology, for example, very different than for cancer therapies, where you have dozens, even hundreds of patients. So that's another parameter that you need to take into account when discussing prices. All right? More questions? If that's all right, let's hand over to family. Charlene raised her hand. You have a question, go ahead. Just turn on your microphone.
Pendant que Charline prend la parole, je prends la responsabilité de dire qu'il faudrait qu'on clore pour 18h30 peut-être.
And I need to remind you that we need to close our meeting by 6:30. Okay. Well, if Charlene is not answering, let's hand over to Emmanuel. Emmanuel also raised her hand. Yes. Can you hear me? We can hear you loud and clear. What a fascinating discussion. Thank you. I'm a mom. Little Vianney died 10 years ago of MLD. All my daughters carry the gene. So this means that if they have a son, potentially he may carry the disease. So it runs in the family. I heard Elodie, I heard her story. We're parents. We're in distress. We know that the government cannot do anything. I know the government cannot do everything for us. But what Caroline Sevin said really touched me. What she said about the time frame, I think we need to reorganize all the knowledge that we have, particularly in terms of NBS, newborn screening. Maybe it's too expensive to treat our children, I don't know, but NBS is key. And NBS is not being done in France, even though it is being done in other countries. We're not doing neonatal screening yet. When you know that a child is going to be sick, and you know that this potentially means gene therapy, transplants, this is all information that we need. But in terms of public policy, today nothing is set in stone, nothing is actually written down when it comes to NBS. That's something that Dr. Caroline Sevin said, and I thought that was very relevant. I'm just speaking from the point of view of a mom. I chair over the National Conference on Ethics together with Jean-François Delfrécy, and what you're saying really touches me. There is political inconsistency in our country. We're being told that antenatal screening for pathologies about which we know there is neonatal screening and therapeutics. That doesn't make any sense. What we're saying is that because therapy is expensive, we're going to promote antenatal screening. There's a contradiction here in terms of public policy. Politicians are saying we do not want to promote eugenics or antenatal screening. We prefer to promote early diagnosis and treatment. You are right to raise that question. But this means we need to screen our children. There's something that needs to be done. Earlier we said that this is something that should be discussed at National Assembly level democratically. I'm sorry for being blunt, but go ahead. If in France we cannot treat those diseases, at least let's be clear about it. The problem is that we're hearing all kinds of things. We're hearing one thing and we're hearing the opposite, and we're giving false hopes to families. So in terms of political ethics, it's a problem. Second discussion. I am not here to defend Pascal or Vincent, but we look at overall healthcare spending policy, 3 times 3 million, okay? 3 patients times 3 million, 9 million. Now, obviously, laboratories are free to drop their prices, but other stakeholders have asked, what about useless spending in our healthcare system? It's a democratic debate we need to have. Management of the hospital system is horrible. Prescriptions in drug prescriptions by self-employed doctors in a city environment. That's terrible. There's so much streamlining we can do, so much useless spending we can take out. Thank you. Now, Caroline Sevin was instrumental in helping Vianney. She supported him until he died. But all my daughters carry the disease. What am I going to tell them in the future? Potentially, if they have a son, their son may carry the gene. What am I going to tell my daughters? Should I tell them that their child is going to be diagnosed at birth and he gets the treatment, or diagnosed before birth and therefore doesn't get to live? What do I tell them? There are solutions out there. There are solutions out there, but we're not caring for our children. At least be clear about it. But then, newborn screening. What should I tell my daughters? Emmanuel, this is not going to relieve your pain, obviously, but read what the National Ethics Committee that requested that policies be made consistent. Now, you're saying this from the bottom of your heart, but there are lots of other people who want consistency in terms of public policy. That's what I want to know. What should I tell my daughters in the future? We need to be clear. What should we do about our children who have those diseases? But thank you for listening. Let me say this again, okay? Because this is what I'm supposed to do here. Before we hand over to Guy for the conclusion, every stakeholder who agreed to be part of today's discussion is a citizen. We have a conscience as a citizen, as a person. They are not personally, individually responsible for those more global questions. I understand that companies or private sector entities, and they apply a capitalist model because that's the prevailing model. It is up to us individually and collectively to change that model so we can create a better future. I agree, says Caroline. Throughout the process, from drug development in the lab to meeting with the patients in the doctor's office, when you meet with a family and you tell them your son or your daughter has a very serious disease and there's no treatment, or even the clinical investigator who gives hope And then when you hear about the Bluebird tragedy, it's one blow after another. And I'm saying this in response to the question put to us by Mateo's mom. Now, whether at the INSERM lab or the ANSM lab, or there are things that could make things better. So the preclinical phase, we're so tempted to give the drug to the kid right away, but we have to go through the preclinical stage. So it is important for us to work together. Today, we're focusing on the endpoint of that adventure, quote unquote, of that journey. But from the very beginning, we need to make a change. We need help. We need to streamline the process, fast track it, make it faster. I know there are constraints. We can't remove those constraints because we need a framework. I agree. We need rules, but there are obstacles, significant impediments. Now, the final stage in the process is pricing, and that's where all the problems coalesce, but there are lots of problems along the way as well. Now, getting back to NBS, clearly this is key in our country. It's simply not possible. It's not possible. It's not possible that a treatment will not be available in France while it is available in other EU countries. Guy, I think you should wrap up because our families have stuck around, and but it's time to. I think it's time to close this meeting. Okay, obviously, I'm not going to ask another questions when we could be discussing all those questions until the cows come home. But I do believe that we've moved forward in our discussion. We've answered some of those questions. I want to extend my warmest thanks to every speaker, really, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for contributing your time, because it's a Saturday, you're here instead of being elsewhere. And also, it's been an emotional time. It's difficult. It can be a painful process being part of such an emotional discussion. Thank you also to the families for sharing their painful stories. I've done it myself dozens of times, and I don't do it anymore because it's so painful. But thank you all for an interesting discussion. We need to think outside the box. I know we have our work cut out for us, and we just need to roll up our sleeves. And I hope that we'll all go home tonight thinking that, yes, it's worth it. It's worth it. We need to continue meeting the needs of families. We need to continue to answer those questions. They are in impossible situations. Now, I don't know which is the solution. When it comes to SKYSONA, because I'm focusing primarily on those two diseases, ALD and MLD, which have treatments available, how do we get SKYSONA back in Europe? If it is possible, then we got to do it fast. Otherwise, we'll find another solution so that European children can go across the ocean and cost will be paid for by their respective countries so that they can get treated in the US. We may have to wait 1 year, several years, before the treatment gets back to the EU, because eventually it will come back. But I believe it is absolutely inadmissible to be in that situation until that happens. So thank you very much for taking part in this discussion, and see you all again soon for our next discussion. Have a great evening. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Merci à vous tous.